Good afternoon and welcome to the San Francisco Planning Commission regular hearing for Thursday, February 26, 2015. I'd like to remind members of the audience that the Commission does not tolerate any disruption or outbursts of any kind. Please silence any mobile devices that may sound off during these proceedings, and when speaking before the Commission, if you care to, do state your name for the record. I'd like to take roll at this time. Commission President Fong.
Here.
Commissioner Vice President Wu.
Here.
Commissioner Antonini.
Present.
Commissioner Johnson.
Here.
Commissioner Moore.
Here.
And Commissioner Richards.
Here.
Commissioners, first on your agenda are items proposed for continuance. Item 1, case number 2014-000348, DRP at 981 Grove Street. Discretionary review is proposed for continuance to March 19th, 2015. Item 2 for case number 2014-002311, PCA, Formula Retail and Large-Scale Retail Planning Code Amendments is proposed for continuance, is proposed for an indefinite continuance. Items 3A and B for case numbers 2014.1426, C and V at 4022 through 4026 24th Street. Conditional use and rear yard variance are also proposed for continuance. I have no other items proposed for continuance, and I have no speaker cards.
Is there any public comment on the items proposed for continuance? Not seeing any. Public comments close. Commissioner Wu.
Move to continue.
Second.
Thank you, Commissioners. On that motion to continue items as proposed, Commissioner Antonini?
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis? Excuse me. Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
Commissioner Moore?
Aye.
Commissioner Richards?
Aye.
Commissioner Wu?
Aye.
And Commission President Fong?
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 6-0. Zoning Administrator, what say you?
Continue that item on the variance for 24th Street indefinitely as well.
Thank you. Commissioners, I'll place you under Commission Matters. Item 4, consideration of adoption draft minutes for your regular hearing on February 5th, 2015, and the draft minutes for the Rules and Regulations Committee for February 12th, 2015, as well as the regular hearing for February 12th, 2015.
Is there any public comment on the draft minutes? Seeing none, public comments closed. Commissioner Moore.
I'm not sure. I only had 2 meeting minutes rather than 3. Not sure. Since I attended the other meeting, there wasn't much to report, so whatever it is.
Which 2 were they, Commissioner Moore? Just to
I have a Thursday 5th regular Planning Commission meeting and Thursday 12th regular Planning Commission meeting. Those are the only 2 I have.
So the Rules Committee meeting minutes are the ones that you're missing?
And he does too, apparently.
Okay.
For whatever reason.
Okay, so can we get a motion to approve the 2 that were included?
The 2 regular hearing minutes? Then?
Sure. Motion to approve.
Second.
Commissioners, on that motion to approve regular meeting minutes for February 5th and February 12th, Commissioner Antonini?
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis? Commissioner Moore?
Aye.
Commissioner Richards?
Aye.
Commissioner Wu?
Aye.
And Commission President Fong?
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0, and I'll be sure to include those minutes for the February 12th Rules Committee hearing in your next packets.
Thank you.
Commissioners, I'll place you on item 5, Commission comments and questions.
Commissioner Antonini.
Yes, some of you may know I was born and grew up in the Livermore Valley, and I've lived in San Francisco for 45 years. And amazingly enough, a lot of those cities, Pleasanton and Livermore, have experienced many of the same challenges that we're experiencing in San Francisco in terms of their popularity, their growth, housing shortages, new jobs being created, and land use. And they've done some things well and some things not so well, but I am going to kind of repair a little report on my experiences because I still am out there frequently. We have property interests there, and part of my family lives there. So I think there are some things that are instructive about things to do and things not to do, which we could use, particularly as we look at our neighborhoods within San Francisco and architectural questions as well as other questions relating to neighborhood areas. So I will have that within a few weeks, as well as some pictures of some of the things they've done architecturally.
Commissioner Wu.
Just wanted to let the commission know I will be missing the hearing next week, March 5th. I'll be at a conference in D.C. called People in Place. It's a group of Asian American, African American, and Latino groups looking at neighborhood-based planning. So we'll be happy to report back.
Thank you. Good luck. Commissioner Richards.
A couple of things. First one, I was last night had the chance to attend the Changing Mission. It was a forum put on by the San Francisco Chronicle, and I think there were 500 to 600 people there, and there was standing room only, and the Mission School Annex, gym or assembly room. And a couple of things kind of really stood out for me was actually, for the first time, I got to hear, as just an audience participant, I wasn't even officially participating other than attending it, real people and their real stories about what they're experiencing in terms of their insecurity around housing and their actual displacement stories. And it was really interesting, and I walked away with a real question around how market rate housing actually can enhance or increase affordable housing. That was one of the big strains that kept going through the meeting. And I know Supervisor Campos was there, and he mentioned this, and the panelists mentioned this, and there were panelists there from the Association of Area Governments and the city, the mayor's office, and some of the nonprofits in the mission. And it kept coming back to that. How do we actually keep increasing market rate housing, and how does that affect affordable housing? And a couple of things resonated with me was, we sat here a few weeks ago and we approved Phil's Coffee, we approved Umpqua Bank, among all these other businesses. And for every market rate housing that we do approve, there's going to need a bank, they're going to need coffee, and the people that are actually working in those businesses are the ones that are going to need the affordable housing. They're probably not going to be able to afford the market rate housing because it's just too expensive. So I think for me there's also a good business sense here that if we increase affordable housing, it actually helps the economy as well, because it's a holistic ecosystem that we're looking at. We heard from the businesses in Fisherman's Wharf that they were having a hard time filling positions there because of transportation issues, so it's hurting them. So I think we need to start looking at this as well this is a good business thing as well to increase not only a good social thing, but also a good business thing to increase affordable housing. So if anybody has any concrete even reasonably, believable relationship on how market rate housing actually can increase affordable housing, I'd be interested in hearing from them. I think the second one is, I think many folks have seen or heard that Supervisor Wiener has introduced interim controls for Corona Heights. We had 53 states. We had 22 and 24 Ord Court. Those came before us. 22 and 24 Ord Court are actually being continued. But I think it's interesting. He actually heard the issues that the neighbors have been talking about with all these developments in Corona Heights, and he has proposed some interim controls, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a little bit more about it when we get our supervisor's report. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Moore.
One aspect about housing which we are not involved in but mostly don't include counting as affordable housing is the issue of homelessness. And somebody forwarded a very interesting article which I will send to Commission Secretary. It is John Steinberg in San Francisco Magazine, Why Can't San Francisco Solve Its Homeless Problem? I'm not sure if you have seen it. It's a very moving article written by Gary Camille, the author of Schoolway City, and the article really touches on a point which I think will move all of us. So I will forward the article to Jonas, Commission Secretary, for all of you to read, and you could pass it on to people in staff if they're so interested.
Commissioners, seeing no further comments, we can move on. But before I do, I did want to mention to the benefit of the public that the Rules Committee was originally scheduled to have its second hearing on March 5th. That meeting is going to be canceled, and it will be held on March 12th instead. Commissioners, Department Matters, Item 6, Director's Announcements.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Just wanted to mention two things today. One is that yesterday we released the draft environmental impact report for the Academy of Art University. I will say that this report is a highly unusual EIR because of the nature of the institution and their multiple locations. It is 1,300 pages long. And I just, if you'll allow me, I just want to take a moment to recognize the staff who have worked incredibly hard on this to get this thing done. And working with a challenging project sponsor, to say the least. Chelsea Fordham, who was the project manager, has worked endlessly on this for the last 3 years. Rick Cooper, Scott Sanchez, who helped a lot looking at enforcement issues with respect to the EIR, as well as Christine Haw, John Purvis, and Susan Mickelson, and also from the City Attorney's Office, Susan Cleveland-Knowles, who has been a huge help on this. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize the staff. We are, the hearing before you on the draft EIR is scheduled for April 16th. There is a longer than normal comment period because of the length, I believe 60 days. The close of the comment period is April 27th. So we will be sending those out to you and probably today, if not, if you don't have them already. Secondly, just wanted to briefly comment on short-term rental work that we're doing. We've had between 600 and 700 calls from folks, many of them, most of them asking for appointments to register. There is a bit of misinformation out there that I, for the record, want to correct both for your purposes as well as the public, which is that there's been some confusion about the requirement of whether a business license is required. Some of the short-term rental platforms had been under the impression that it is not. It is, in fact, explicitly required in the legislation that to do short-term rental, one must first obtain a business license before coming to the planning department to register. So just for purposes of the public, especially who are interested in this, it's very important that you have that business license when you come to the department to register for doing short-term rental. And with that, that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, item 7, review of past events at the Board of Supervisors, the Board of Appeals. There was no Historic Preservation Commission hearing yesterday.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Aaron Starr, Planning Department staff. This week at the Land Use Committee, we had one item. There were interim controls for building permits for commercial uses in the area bound by Market, 2nd, Brennan, Division, and South Van Ness. It was sponsored by Supervisor Kim. This ordinance would require a posted notice for certain building permits for commercial buildings. These interim controls extended previous enacted controls that expired of December last year. The item was amended and continued to next week. At the full board, we only had 2 items. The office conversion controls in landmark buildings for PDR districts passed its 2nd read, so it's on its way to the mayor. And the appeal hearing for 2655 Broderick Street, it was an environmental appeal that was withdrawn, so was good. There were 2 introductions. The first one was a hearing request by Supervisors Farrell and Christensen on the Planning Department's capabilities to enforce the short-term rental ordinances and the financial resources necessary for effective enforcement. This is a quick hearing. It'll be next week. I believe Scott will be attending that one, and so will our enforcement staff. And then the interim controls that Supervisor Richards mentioned, Richardson, sorry.
Commissioner.
It's intended to address the issues of what are commonly referred to as monster homes in the Corona Heights area. And it lasts for 18 months and will probably result in permanent controls. That concludes my remarks. Thanks.
Thank you.
And the Board of Appeals did meet last night. 2 items briefly of note. First is 3828 Cesar Chavez. This had been before you. It has somewhat of a convoluted history. Unfortunately, the permit was issued in error, but we did bring it before you for your comments. You wanted to deny this permit. We did not have kind of alignment with the Board of Appeals on denying the permit. It was essentially issued administratively after the appeal last night. So today I issued a revocation request to Department of Building Inspection to have them revoke that permit. Very clearly, it was issued in error. The second item is 1784 Sanchez. This was before you as a discretionary review in September, on September 18th. There was also a variance associated with this. It was a horizontal addition in the rear and a minor vertical addition in the required rear yard. Last night was the appeal of the building permit and the variance decision. The board had some very serious concerns about the variance matter, and there was some, I think, alignment about denying the variance application. They ultimately continued it and wanted the parties to work together to see if they could come to some resolution on the proposal. So that will be on calendar for March 18th, and they did ask the department to offer kind of some ability to meet with the parties and hopefully come to a resolution. So we will offer that. The next hearing that the board actually has is March 18th, so they won't be meeting until then. So there'll be no board reports for the next 2 weeks. So that's all. Thank you.
Commissioners, it'll place us under general public comment not to exceed a period of 15 minutes at this time. Members of the public may address the Commission on items of interest to the public that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Commission, except agenda items. With respect to agenda items, your opportunity to address the Commission will be afforded when the item is reached in the meeting. Each member of the public may address the Commission for up to 3 minutes. I have no speaker cards.
Is there any public comment today?
Commissioners, it'll place you under your regular calendar. Item 8, the Market Octavia Living Alley Network Project. This is an informational presentation.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. David Winslow, Planning Department staff. It's my pleasure to be here today to provide an overview of the Market Octavia Living Alley program, including a toolkit which I believe you received in your packet. Through the last 2 years, through a generous grant provided from Caltrans in partnership with Public Works and MTA, the Planning Department has been working with the community members in the Market Octavia plan to develop a toolkit and prototypes and a means by which to distribute $2 million in impact fees that were specifically allocated to alley improvements in the Market Octavia area. As you may or may not know, the Market Octavia plan, contains numerous high-volume arterials that carry over 100,000 vehicle trips daily. In addition, the Market Octavia area plan is also gridded with an extensive network of alleys. And it was envisioned that, interspersed between these, that occupy a full 6% of the entire area of the Market Octavia plan, which is not an insignificant spatial resource in a dense urban environment. It was envisioned in the Market Octavia plan that these alleys could serve as walkable public open spaces that offset the bustling traffic of the arterials that lace the area plan. The Market Octavia plan also envisioned a process that enabled and empowered residents to propose living alley improvements, and this program is an extension of that. In other words, it's a toolkit to provide residents, business owners with the information of achieving a living alley. So through a series of community workshops over the past 2 years, which began with defining and envisioning what living alleys were, to presenting a range of strategies and technical design parameters, which we also sought to engage community members or solicit community groups to come forward with design proposals for their specific alleys that we could then use as prototypes to inform our toolkit. We received 4 applications for living alleys, and then through a process of attrition ended up with 2 that are still going forward. And using these as prototypes, we've developed a toolkit of 20 distinct tools that we then could use to vet through various design criteria and technical parameters. We just completed our last workshop last night, and it was heartily received. Through this process, we also established a series of goals to frame our discussion of living alleys. 4 goals that emerged from that are that living alleys should be green, they should be shared, they should be vibrant, and they should be clean and safe. We also undertook through these prototypes to determine several design parameters that would have high impact on the design and feasibility of any improvements that people decided to pursue, such as hydraulics, the conveyance of water over, through, and ultimately into the storm sewer system, road composition and underground utilities that needed to be considered, emergency vehicle access, disability or universal accessibility, parking and traffic concerns, as well as crossings. We also included in our toolkit a sampling of mapped existing conditions of almost a third of the entire alley network in the Market Octavia plan to enable people that might happen to live on that alley a head start to be able to start engaging with, understanding, and understanding the physical constraints that their alley has. So here's an example of one of our 20 tools in the toolkit, raised crosswalks, for example. In the upper part, we have a kind of a scroll bar that just describes the relative range of cost and the level of involvement. It then describes the use and the function in relation to one of the 4 goals, and the design and location criteria. And then on the blue sidebars, following some additional resources that one might want to reference for continuing to look at that particular tool in relation to how to implement it. In addition to our design tools, we've included implementation resources to help community groups organize, design, permit, and build, and ultimately live or enjoy their alleys. Specifically, things people need to know are expected costs and potential funding sources. One of the funding sources that are available through the Market Octavia plan, as I mentioned, is the $2 million in impact fee. And I'll get to that in a moment of how we use this criteria to determine how to distribute that to eligible community groups. We also looked at potential partnerships, both public departments as well as private partnerships that would enable a smaller community group to carry off such a large undertaking. And then we've outlined permitting processes, not by themselves on a pretty large goal, actually. So with this information in mind, people can go in with full understanding of what it takes to really develop and build a living alley. We developed 2 main prototypes through collaboration with our community groups. And the first one is a shared street prototype, using this example on the 200 block of Lilly, which is, if you're familiar with it, 200 block of Ivy, which is behind Arlequin Cafe. We envisioned a series of incremental steps, starting with just sidewalk plantings, to a full-blown single-surface shared street that prioritizes pedestrians and signals to automobiles that they're on a pedestrian priority street. The second type that we developed was in response to community groups' concerns that not everybody can undertake such a large capital undertaking as a shared street. It's fairly expensive to do that, and it's time-consuming. What's a lower cost intervention that we might entertain? And that's what we've dubbed as a living zone prototype, where it's simply taking a place in an alley that does not have existing curb cuts and garage access, and being able to claim it as space for residents to furnish in a more or less spontaneous way, but basically creating the space for them to do so in a low-cost way with the idea of closing it through traffic, through the use of bollards and other elements, perhaps gates. And here's an example of how it might evolve over time into a little bit more full body thing. So the next steps, as I mentioned, we have a toolkit that describes design tools. We have a toolkit that describes process. We also have a funding source. Getting the funding into the hands of interested community groups, we've decided to go through a community challenge grant that's specifically tailored to these types of projects. And that will be rolled out in April 2015. We have decided that in response to these prototypes, we'll do small, medium, and large categories, with the large category being capped out at about $250,000 for a full-bodied shared street example like I showed in the first prototype. The other things that we have on our plate for next steps is that we'd like to continue to work with other city departments to develop city standards for shared streets. Currently, the onus is on the project sponsors, community groups, to undertake the ongoing maintenance and liability of these streets in perpetuity because they, in fact, deviate from the city-accepted standards of a curb and gutter sidewalk. I think there's certain things that we might discuss in moving forward that the city could examine taking under their wing, especially if it could be demonstrated that there's a cost benefit involved and that there's, in fact, enhanced performance, whether that be through accessibility or fire parameters. So, thirdly, included in your handbook is a diagram, I think, in the back page that shows the permitting process that's probably in excess of 18 months with multiple city jurisdictions involved. I think there's room in that, continuing with the dialogue with other city agencies to somehow streamline that and coordinate a design review that enables people to know with certainty earlier on rather than later on what the pitfalls might be and shorten the permitting process and possibly costs. So, number 4, this toolkit was developed specifically for the Market Octavia plan because it had the funding source and the policy, but the information included is applicable to any and all alleys throughout the city. We would like to encourage some kind of city commitment that if these are indeed considered a benefit to the city, that somehow this be extended to the other neighborhoods in San Francisco. Lastly, I would like to thank planning staff, Jessica Look, who is also on the team for this work, and Mike Rieger from Public Works, as well as Bassam Aldafari, Nick Elsner, Kevin Jensen from Public Works, Will Tabayanda, and Laura Stonehill and Patrick Golier from MTA for collaboration with our project. Well, I'll be here to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. We do have one speaker card. It's Alice Light.
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm Alice Light, Director of Community Planning at the Todco Group. The Living Alleys Toolkit is really good work. It has a lot of great information about how to beautify an alley. But alleys are more than nice packages and prototypes. Unless there is already a broader, comprehensive neighborhood building plan in place, it is only a piecemeal set of physical improvements that don't actually address all of the priorities in the neighborhood. So you need to use something more like a community building alley toolkit, like what Todco is applying to alleys in Soma. We've been doing neighborhood building since 1980, and we know that it takes more than beautification to realize the full potential of neighborhood alleys. Working on an alley in isolation can lead to mistakes and to serious problems. We've seen this happen. So the starting point before you do anything else needs to be a comprehensive analysis of everything in the area to really understand what's going on. In Soma, we look at a single block because the blocks are so large, but in other neighborhoods, you might look at a cluster of a few blocks where the blocks are smaller. This phase is all about observing, documenting, reaching out, learning about neighborhood needs, about safety concerns, opportunities, and challenges on the block, all the ins and outs of the specific and unique situation of that block and alley. This must be a thorough analysis. It could take a year. In the Living Alleys Toolkit, the analysis stage is given less time than any other phase in the 3-year timeline. It's given only 1 month. It's a huge mistake to pass over and shortchange this stage of analysis. Only after this thorough analysis is done can community visioning and design begin. Here's an example of a plan that Todco did utilizing community building techniques. It's Clementina Alley, which we know will be prioritized for improvements because of its proximity to the central subway stop at 4th and Folsom. This plan is also continually evolving based on neighborhood feedback. Elements of our community building alley toolkit that are not in the city toolkit are stop signs, dog spots, security cameras, traffic control officers, fitness zones, on-street garbage corrals, private property betterment, motorcycle parking, and food truck zones. When it's time to do alleyway improvements in Soma, it's important that we do so with a community building alley toolkit. We want more than beautification. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Tom Radulovich here, Executive Director of Livable City, and just wanted to say this is a great and very inspiring presentation. Linden Living Alley is one of our favorite projects in the city, and Livable City gave it an award years ago. We think this shared space idea for the city's alleyways is tremendous, reclaiming green spaces in a city where about 25% of our city is city streets. So it's a terrific opportunity in terms of reclaiming some of that for open space. And alleyways are certainly a need. So we'd love to see the Hayes Valley projects go forward. We love the idea of these street standards. One of the real challenges for Linden Living Alley and other projects is, every one of these is a crafts project. You have to go through ages of city approval, and they reinvent all of this. And ISCOT can be very arbitrary, and so on and so forth. So that idea of a standard or toolkit, that okay, if you build it in this way, you're likely to get approved, and there's less review, is really, really important. So moving forward with those standards would be great. And then also that commitment to doing this in more neighborhoods. Our office is on Natoma Street. I believe Alice just showed what that looks like. So we've got a pretty robust alleyways program that came out of the SOMA redevelopment planning, and then some with the Western SOMA planning. So various city agencies, redevelopment, planning, DPW, Transportation Authority, were involved in planning various alleyways around our part of SOMA, however, and then there's a robust program going on in Chinatown as well to reclaim alleyways and build them out incrementally. So we've got some great examples of neighborhood programs. There's a lot of neighborhoods who could really use this. So I met recently with neighbors in sort of, let's say, the southeast corner of SOMA, around the Caltrain station going up into South Park. There are a lot of alleyways there. There's going to be a lot of development pressure. There's a lot happening in that neighborhood. They want to reclaim some of those alleyways as public spaces. So the idea of more neighborhood alleyway plans is a great idea, and then also creating an implementation interdepartmental, it's got to be an implementation mechanism to make sure that these plans move into reality would be good. And as Alice said, the community engagement early on, having, single points of contact for neighborhoods, having these kind of community developed and led alleyway planning processes are really important. The other thing you might look at is development requirements like the POPO's requirement and others, where we say, okay, you have to provide open spaces. Well, rather than some stale corporate plaza, maybe that's turning an alleyway into pedestrian space. So can you look at existing requirements of the code and say, all right, how can we turn these into alleyway improvements so that people could see these as benefits from development projects happening in their neighborhood? So we commend this effort and urge you to support all of the follow-up steps to make these things happen. Thank you.
Is there any additional public comment? Okay, public comment is closed. Commissioner Richards.
I just have a couple of questions, Mr. Winslow. It's good to see you here. We were on the Market Artavia CSC briefly. What are the two alleys that made the final cut?
The 200 block of Ivy and the 200 block of Lily.
Okay, so Hayes Valley.
So both of those are, and this was, I'm going to answer the question before you ask it, hopefully. Well, I'll give you more to chew on. Both of those were commercial and institutionally sponsored sponsors. So the commentary, and I think you were on the CAC at that time, was, what are you doing for the small homeowner resident who wants to try and do this with such a heavy lift? Mm-hmm. And so we thought hard about that and tried to come up with that second prototype that would be the
light version.
Light version, but just as in a way, just as effective.
Great. Thank you. I guess I have a question for Mr. Wertheim.
He's not involved in this.
Well, we have another area plan. We have another area plan coming, right? So, to what extent is this going to be kind of parlayed into Central SOMA? I haven't read that deeply the plan yet, so maybe you can help us.
It is kind of one of those after plans. Kind of this was for Market Octavia. It's like get the plan set, understand the big picture, where the funding would come from, et cetera, and then all the streetscape stuff will be cleared in the EIR, but all the very specific streetscape stuff requires much more additional analysis, and this would be both the large streets where we have substantial changes proposed and the alleys would be subsequent community conversation.
But it's a priority, though. It's mentioned as a priority. Okay, great. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. One other last question for Alice from Toddco. If you could just, briefly, can you tell me what the similarities are between your community-based alley process and the process that we heard Mr. Winslow talk about, and the differences? I'd really like to hear that.
Okay. Well, I think the Living Alleys Toolkit really is a great document, and it sounds like there was a long process to figure out what the pieces of the toolkit are. But it's a little concerning when it's seen as a prototype that could be applied to any street without really looking at what is the context of the block. And that's where our process is different. Or at least maybe I missed that in this document, but it seemed that the analysis stage, once you get to an alley, was very short in the Living Alleys Toolkit, that it's just a month, and it takes longer than that to even figure out who's on the block and what is going on and figure out how traffic is working and what the different needs are. So I'd say one of the keys is that length of time. And also, we really focus a lot on pedestrian safety and security. It really, in SOMA, if you don't have eyes on the street, other people will take it. Safety is really a big concern. So things like security cameras. People drive through SOMA like it's freeways, so having traffic control officers. Some of those things that aren't sexy, they aren't pretty, they aren't beautiful, but we need them to keep those areas safe for the people walking through them.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Moore.
This is a remarkable product. I like to challenge that we start to develop an alley qualification criteria checklist for all alleys in the city, so that anything we do, and even if we cannot do it right now, anticipates that we will be using a very systematic alley improvement project throughout the city, particularly in those areas where densification inadvertently will be happening, has already happened, and we haven't been able to hold the line for future alley improvements. Case in point, Tumark Urban on Pine Street between Polk and Van Ness. I strongly raise the issue that the building needs to respond with a positive use on the ground floor. The cross-section of the alley, particularly as it is embedded in the Van Ness corridor plan, needs to provide light into the alley. This is a layered three-dimensional effort as well. It's not just preservation of existing alleys, which are fully already vested in strong, large neighborhood plans, but it is looking ahead. And it's preventing the worst. And I would even challenge the director about looking very closely at the qualification list and looking where new buildings have large garage entrances, because garage entrances can destroy alleys altogether. Particularly in San Francisco, we have not yet invented any local access only provisions for people who go through the alleys. We talked about that down on Folsom Street. And it's a very complex set of moves, which are transportation as well as building-related issues, one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional. And I strongly urge you to particularly also look at east-west alleys, which are the ones which have the most access to light, because in order to use an alley for the purposes that you were describing, the environmental benefit of light, sunlight, is extremely important. But otherwise, it's a great piece. I just beg you, urge you to take this and very quickly start projecting it into the future. Thank you.
Commissioner Antonini.
Question for Mr. Winslow. Did your analysis include, or your report included an analysis of all these different alleys in Market Octavia as to the amount of automobile traffic that each of these alleys experiences in a given day?
Other than anecdotally, no. We asked that question of our partners at MTA, and they did not have that data, except for a few select alleys, I believe, that had been studied under the Market Octavia environmental analysis.
Well, the reason I bring that up, I see that you do different things here. You've got your shared street, and then you have your living zone, the two types you were having, and the latter one, I think you had closed it to automotive traffic except for the traffic needed for residential, which sounds like a really good idea. I don't know if you have to get a street vacation for that or how that actually happens, but
We're not exactly sure after conversing with our partners either what the exact permit of that is, whether it's a temporary closure or if it's a major street encroachment. It's some kind of strange hybrid that we're still scratching our heads over, quite frankly.
well, I would encourage that kind of study to occur because there's certain alleys that are, places where people do use them quite a bit for everyday traffic, automotive, and many of them are rarely used. And the ones that are not essential to keep open, it would be wise that we could close some of those except for residential, because my belief is that the amount of traffic generated by residential is extremely low. It's only when people are coming and going that may not even happen in the course of a day. But if it's an alley where people use it as a shortcut to something else, then that is also a lot more dangerous because people are not actually residents there. They're just using it as a cut through. So, I think that the more of them you can close to non-residential use, the more you'll quiet these alleys. And even some of them that are used more heavily, then you can certainly discourage this by bollards or by raised sidewalks or a lot of other things that, because usually where there's a cut through, there's another way to do it if you're spend enough time driving another half a block. That's what often will happen. People will cut through there because they don't want to go another half block onto a major street where they have to deal with more pedestrians and more traffic.
So I want to confirm your anecdotal observations as those that are consistent with everything that we've studied. There's two types of traffic: the type that comes and goes from their garages and the type that flies through because they don't want to wait for that signal at the other cross street. And that's the one that aggravates the local residents or neighbors, and it would be a solution to try and control that with various parts of this toolkit, not just the living zones area, but I think there are other traffic calming tools in this toolkit.
Yeah, even on the shared street where you could close the middle of it if there wasn't any residential parking
Potentially,
in that
or
area.
even a hybrid of
would
those two.
Probably work well, and people who actually live there would be probably very encouraging of it because it's their street and they want it to be calm and they wouldn't mind having to come in a certain side to be able to get to their garage and come in and out. But that makes sense. Thank you very much. I just had a couple of other comments. I think that Todco raised some very good things to include the bollards I mentioned, the alley lighting. Lighting is a good safety measure, security cameras, and a security officer, which would help to not only discourage, drivers who may not be careful, but also other antisocial activities that can easily occur in alleys when you provide a nice space for people and it's abused. So that's really a good idea. And Mr. Radulovich had a good idea. That's something we have to look at in city policy to allow, instead of privately owned public spaces, they could do the same thing by retrofitting an alley nearby and making it a living alley. So that's a good idea. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you very much. Just real quick, thank you very much for the report. Really great job, as always, with the whole team. Just a couple things, and these comments are just in light of the fact that it sounds like, I think it's an excellent idea to think about how to integrate this into city policy and streamline it a little bit more so that a living alley project is not a one-off sort of cobbled together experience. So just a couple quick things. When talking about shared alleys, whether or not they're closed off to vehicular traffic, I think that there needs to be a lot of thought put into different models for how to segregate uses. I think back to the work what we're doing on reimagining Embarcadero, because what started off as essentially a very long park with shared uses from walking to cycling and everything in between, and it's now become a little bit burdensome, and we're now trying to do the hard work of reimagining that. So I think that there are certain alleys in San Francisco, particularly in our Central Soma and Southeast spaces, where those collision of uses could definitely become problematic. So anything that can be done to think about how to make sure that the flow of uses in a space, whether or not cars are in the mix, is thought out properly and not based on one-off assessments of every single alley would be great. I appreciate Mr. Rudilovich's comments on popos. The only thing I would say is I think that there is something to keeping the policy we have where popos have to be created within a half mile or quarter mile, I think, of the actual building. And because there are so many long alleys in Soma, it's going to be hard to have one alley per project, if that makes sense. Like if every time you have a building where popos would be part of the community benefits, it's going to be hard to have one entity or one project sponsor an entire alley. So if you want to think about that, I would think, what are ways that we can design full alleys and have, if we want to have that be the community benefit, have there be some sort of proportional responsibility to get a larger living alley project done versus saying that one project sponsor has to complete one complete project, because I think there are alleys that are it's just too big of a pull, too many big spaces for those people. And then the other thing is, last sort of a comment, I really appreciate this work because I think as we think ahead to Pier 70, which after the last voter approval will be coming to us in the coming years, we think about the completed build out of Mission Bay, and as we think Southeast and Central Soma and some spaces that are starting to come together with new street networks. And I even think like Hope SF, where we're sort of redoing entire street networks in some of these communities. If we have a smart policy for alleys, it makes it a lot easier to implement and want to create alleys in new street networks. So I definitely appreciate the thought that's going into this, because when you think of an alley right now as something that needs to be remediated, it becomes hard to think that you'd want to create a new one. Like, why would you want to create a new problem? So this is a really great way to say, no, you can start from a position of alleys are good, and they're a good part of communities, and they're a good part of street infrastructure and our circulation network, and let's see how we can build them in from the ground up. So thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Wu.
Thanks. I also want to thank staff for the report. I think especially calling out this 18-month implementation timeline is is one of the biggest challenges of getting alleyways done. And so we can see if there's a way to expedite or just have better coordination to make sure we're not doing so many design iterations. I want to kind of piggyback on the comments of Todd Coe. I think that for alleyway improvements, there was this paper out of UC Berkeley last year called something just green enough, right? And so the goal isn't always making the most beautiful alleyway, the most wonderful design, but what having a people-based assessment about what the people in that alleyway really need. And maybe it's just green enough. Maybe it's not the most beautiful alleyway. Maybe it is much more stop signs or whatever, bollards, pedestrian safety improvements, and so that it's meeting the needs of the people that live there. Because I think actually, I made this comment similarly on parklets, I think there's a possibility that these kind of improvements actually just make it more attractive for other people to come into the neighborhood, and that it's not really serving the needs of those who live there. And then I think we get into questions about gentrification or displacement. There may not be a one-to-one correlation, but I think it's part of the larger picture. So really wanting to make sure that we're investing in the capacity of residents to be able to implement their visions.
Commissioner Hillis.
A question on funding. You mentioned there's funding available. Is that only for Market Octavia, or is that?
I'm not aware of the Eastern Neighborhoods parameters for funding. They do have impact fees. I think they do have allocations for public realm improvements. I'm not sure if they go towards alleys or not, but the Market Octavia specifically.
Right. I was just going to say that the impact fees have to be spent within.
Oh, yeah, so the source is the impact fees.
Yeah, impact fees from and spent in the Market Octavia.
Yeah, because there was a project we heard a while back, Roush Street. It was on Folsom and Roush, where that exact issue you brought up. People were complaining about, they were objecting to the development. because of traffic, although we all thought the traffic was coming from cut-throughs. And, they could have benefited. I mean, they were screaming for improvements like this on their alley. But so what's the plan? I guess that's got to be allocated within the Eastern Neighborhoods Plan because I agree with you, these can be used everywhere as kind of the baseline toolkit, so we should, try to quickly expand.
Let's get it right in the Market Octavia and then go.
Yeah, although we've seen it work. I mean, there's basic streetscape improvements that I think are called out in every plan that we need funding for.
This is this toolkit is specifically directed towards community-driven. I want to address the Todco comment. It is supposed to enable that kind of level of, what are our specific needs on this alley, and how do we design around them in an appropriate manner. However, the information is also applicable to a lot of other alleys that we see delivered through developments that we use. For example, on Parcel P in the Octavia, off Octavia, is the developer themselves volunteered through certain direction of ours to implement a living alley on Hickory. So there's developer-led and driven projects, and then there's community-led and driven projects. And the information's good for everybody, but there's other tools in this toolkit that specifically enable, the people who live there to undertake this.
And you mentioned getting the city to kind of take responsibility for the improvements. So how does it work now? I remember this coming up in Linden when you were working.
How does it work now? It's I wish I had my big diagram, but for a later date. So for a major street encroachment such as Linden, for example, the design costs, the funding costs of the improvement, and the maintenance costs, which includes liability insurance as well as maintaining the trees and paving and so forth, are all incumbent upon that entity, the community entity that undertakes that project. So I have a model, for example, that demonstrates that overall cost. 20-year life cycle, the maintenance cost is about $400,000. The construction cost increment is probably for an entire block about $250,000 to $400,000. The design and soft costs are probably about $175,000. All that, especially the first dollars in, construction as well as design, is all incumbent upon these little community groups.
Right.
So we have this fund, $2 million, that we can distribute to kind of offset that design and construction costs. But there's still going to be day in, day out, year in, year out, spending that money cumulatively, for the maintenance, which is a large sum. It's almost as much as the construction cost. Right. So we're trying to work with, that assumption, saying, okay, is that a fair distribution of costs when there's possibly some city benefits that now we have to demonstrate and prove that accrue to the city, and so maybe the city could be it takes some more of the sharing.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But that's going to be another discussion well beyond today.
Right, but I think that's going to be key for us to be able to expand this beyond a couple of select alleys. And in the example of a developer doing it like Parcel P, how do they take on the future?
I think they got to root away, like everybody. That's also, know first that you have to do the maintenance at the end before you kind of promise. So they and others have been in that rude awakening period where they realize we've got to do the maintenance. We're on the hook for this. And so it's still that case. The city does not accept the maintenance responsibilities of the.
If I could add to that, this is actually an issue that's come up in the last several months repeatedly with all these kinds of projects, with special street design projects or special utility projects, where the city is being very cautious about accepting the maintenance responsibilities because it's not the standard approach to how they do street and utility design. And so it's something that we've been talking about within the Capital Planning Committee and other venues in the city to try to get a handle on how we can, as David said, number one, get the city to accept these designs as part of their standard palette, if we can show them that their costs aren't any greater. Or secondly, establish some kind of maintenance fund that's out of the ordinary city processes, because this is starting to affect a lot of the work that we're doing in the public realm, and we're very concerned that we don't want to stop doing these work and doing these street and alleyway improvements based on the inability of the city to maintain them over time.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your comments.
Commissioner Richards.
Just one quick question. So Linden's the only one that we have up and running. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. So who actually took the responsibility for the maintenance? You did?
And one other person, Loring Sagan, the owner of the building at 315 Linden.
Okay, wow. What happens if you go away?
Discussion that we have daily with DPW.
Well, the reason why I'm asking is, I come from a community group, and things go in waves. You get a lot of involvement, and then 5 years later, everybody's tired and burnt out, and then nothing happens. And that's
I did go away.
A long time. I mean, it's a long time.
So ideally, so our ideal model that we had was a kumbaya, everybody's in. Mm-hmm. And, the greater the shared burden, the greater the longevity, the greater the inputs of, everybody taking mutual responsibility. That didn't happen because of the fear factor. And the fools that rushed in were me and him.
Right.
However, it's organically kind of like, hey, this isn't so bad. It's kind of like Stone Soup. Wait a minute, I can contribute to this. They didn't necessarily sign on the dotted line, but they are contributing money now.
Okay.
And so the goal is, and one of the tools that we want that's in this toolkit is, means for establishing a CBD as an example of how you kind of organize a shared responsibility for ongoing maintenance as well as the initial funding. So.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, seeing nothing further, we can move on to item 9, update to the San Francisco Economic Strategy. This is also an informational presentation.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Steve Wertheim, Planning Department staff. The session is an update to the San Francisco Economic Strategy. This session is at the request of the Office of Economic and Workforce Development. And I'll just turn over to the speakers. We have Todd Rufo, who is the Director of the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, Laurel Levanatidis, who is the Business Development Director at OEWD, and Ted Egan, who is the city's Chief Economist.
Thanks, Steve. Commissioners, great to be back before you. Todd Rufo, Director, Office of Economic and Workforce Development. I wanted to start, before we get going on the content, I want to do just a quick overview and roadmap for the day. I'm going to open with a little bit of summary of how we got to where we're at today, what the economic strategy is all about. I'm going to hand it over to Laurel Levanatidis, who's going to talk through some of the actions that we've taken to date against the recommendations of the economic strategy. Ted Egan will follow Laurel and talk through the economic performance in the last economic cycle, as well as remaining barriers to growth in the city's economy that he identified. And then I'll be back up to talk about some of the next steps and where we're going to go from here. So actually, before that, back in 2004, voters approved Proposition I, which for the first time directed the city to create an economic strategy, which was completed in 2007. Proposition I also required that the city provide periodic updates to the economic strategy, and this report is the culmination of an update. So we're bringing that before you because we wanted to, again, it's in draft form, so we wanted to get your feedback, your thoughts, and share with all of you the findings, since so much of it is relevant to the work that you do every day at the Planning Commission. I want to acknowledge sort of the other departments that were involved in this. Obviously, the Office of Economic Analysis, OEWD, Sarah Dennis Phillips is also here today, who worked hard on a number of the sections. Our friends in the Planning Department, as well as a range of other departments in the city. So with that, let me just dive into a couple of the key findings from the original economic strategy. This slide, you may recall, was Ted Egan's summation of how the city's economy was structured. And a couple of key points stood out to me, and I think is a guiding principle for us in OEWD. And the first is that the city's economy is really driven by its relationship to external markets, meaning the 49 square miles of San Francisco. What are the sectors that are exporting products, goods, and services, and knowledge and information and services out to external markets, which then brings income and economic activity into the city. And so 3 key areas: financial and professional services, the creative industries, as well as the experience industries, which is a good way of saying our tourism industry. Key export industries, subsectors within that, certainly that's not exhaustive, are listed below. And just as important, but keenly interrelated are our local serving industries. And so that's everything from construction and real estate to our PDR industries, the industrial sector, distribution, transportation sectors, as well as our social services, healthcare, that ensure that our people, the physical infrastructure and our people infrastructure are strong to drive our export industries. So that was a key summation of one of the important findings that the 2007 report came together with. Another key finding, I think, was the overarching goals that the city needs to keep in mind as it thinks about economic development strategy. And just to summarize these three, the first is to create job opportunities that not only build on our strengths, but also drive economic growth. And that's critical because it means that we need to focus in our economic strategies of where we're strong and not try to do something that we're trying to create out of whole cloth, but focus on our strengths and ensure that it drives economic growth. And economic growth is tied very keenly into number two, which is ensuring that we have strong inclusion and equity in the job opportunities that we're creating. And as you all know, that is fundamental to the work that we do in economic and workforce development, because that's ultimately how you address inequality, by creating good job opportunities and good pathways to those job opportunities so that residents can continually ladder their skills and have increased earning potential in the city. Finally, and most, sort of as a fundamental point, we need to ensure that through the economic strategy that we have a strong fiscal footing within the city, that our budget remains strong so that we can invest in the priorities that the city establishes. The economic strategy concluded with 19 key recommendations across 5 key foundational areas, from education to business climate to the quality of life, infrastructure, and innovation. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I wanted to put that up there to share with all of you and the members of the public to show that the economic strategy was very, very comprehensive and thoughtful about how all the different pieces within the city and many of the pieces the Planning Commission touches are interrelated and affect how the economy functions and how we achieve the goals on the previous slide. But Laurel Arvanitidis is going to speak through the actions that OEWD, the Planning Department, and a whole range of departments across the city have taken to advance these objectives next. So I'm going to invite Laurel up here now.
Thanks, Todd. As Todd mentioned, I'm going to be covering some of the actions that the city has taken as a result of the recommendations from the 2007 strategy. And I've broken these actions, my summary of these actions, down by the 5 foundations outlined. The first set of policy goals and actions center around education and training. OEWD developed and has implemented a program aligning our workforce programs around industry growth sectors. This sector academy approach has been very successful with the creation of 4 distinct sector academies: one in construction, one in healthcare, one in information technology, and one in hospitality. One good example of our hospitality academy is the new Market on Market over in the quote-unquote Twitter building. 40% of the hires there were through our hospitality program. So it's a great story for us. It's successful placement of people into the jobs we're creating. In addition to our work with sector academies, we have partnered with the school district on career technical education programs and have added the school district to our WISF board, the Advisory Board for Workforce. These changes allow the school district greater connection to the city's major employers and have allowed us to align our training academies with school district curriculum, creating a very clear pathway to employment for our city's youth. And finally, we've been working to close the digital divide. Studies show that for every 20% of broadband penetration, there's a correlated 1% growth in GDP. The city has provided over 200,000 hours of digital literacy training and media training, established or revamped 14 youth tech labs and 54 neighborhood technology centers. We're expanding our high-speed penetration of broadband with over 130 miles of fiber optic cables, bringing broadband to all of our public housing sites, and now focusing on Wi-Fi expansion through our parks, the northern waterfront, along Market Street, across Treasure Island, and throughout the Civic Center. Action Area 2 addresses governance and business climate. Perhaps the most visual thing that has taken place is our transition from a payroll expense tax to gross receipts tax, moving the taxation system from one tied to job creation and broadening the base of taxpayers. Much like our workforce strategy realignment, we've developed sector initiatives within our business development team, ensuring that businesses from every sector have a single point of contact within City Hall. This sector initiative has also allowed us to strengthen our private sector partnerships, working closely not only directly with businesses, but groups like the Chamber, Spur, SF Made, Bay Bio, Golden Gate Restaurant Association, SF Travel, and then many of our local merchant associations, ethnic, women, and LGBT chambers of commerce. This allows for better communication regarding proposed policies and regulations within City Hall and faster awareness for us in City Hall of a rising business needs. In 2008, OEWD launched China SF, a public-private initiative focused on attracting growing Chinese firms to establish offices in San Francisco. In 5 years, we saw the recruitment of 44 new businesses to San Francisco, and based on this success, we've expanded the initiative to Greater Asia and Latin America, working to expand our base of international companies in San Francisco while providing opportunities for local companies to more easily expand into international markets and broaden their base. Perhaps our most important job as government is to continue to ensure that we make it easy and possible to do business in San Francisco. In 2008, we launched the One Stop Business Assistance Center, providing targeted one-on-one assistance to businesses trying to start and grow in San Francisco. And in the first 6 years, they helped 16,500 small business clients. To improve even further on this experience, last November, we launched a new online business portal. This user-focused tool provides comprehensive information resources for starting and growing a business in San Francisco, allowing anyone looking to do this the opportunity to access the information from the comfort of their home or their business on their own schedule, not ours here at City Hall. Finally, through the city's expanded work with the business community, we've been able to develop and refine a number of tools that provide assistance to our small businesses. Access to capital is always their number one concern, so we launched an $800,000 revolving loan fund program, which provided capital loans of up to $50,000. Hearing need for additional capital, we launched the Emerging Business Loan Fund, which provides loans from the range of $50,000 to $1 million. And then also hearing from small businesses that needed access to less capital, we launched the microloan program, which provides no interest loans of $7,500. We also heard from businesses a need to help complying with the American with Disabilities Act, so we created an assessment program. The assessment program creates an assessment report, a plan for compliance, and provides access to additional loans and grants to implement that plan for compliance. More than 250 businesses were served in the first year. And we created the Job Squad in 2013 to provide direct outreach to the business at their place of business. Again, trying to make it easier and easier to access the tools of City Hall. To date, the Job Squad has met with over 5,400 businesses and assisted more than 270 of them. The third action item is quality of life. When we think about quality of life in San Francisco, our diverse and thriving neighborhoods are a major component. With the launch of Invest in Neighborhoods, a cross-departmental initiative to strengthen and revitalize 25 commercial corridors, dedicated staff for each corridor worked with community partners to develop an action plan specific to the commercial district's unique needs, strengths, and opportunities. With this roadmap, the city is better able to prioritize streetscape improvements, I don't know what happened, business attraction efforts, and the deployment of loans and grant opportunities. With many districts looking to focus on beautification projects, the city's SF Shines facade grant program has deployed $1.6 million to improve 47 small business storefronts. And with the coordination of services from DPW planning and the MTA through Invest in Neighborhoods, streetscape improvements are ever better coordinated with the community. Many neighborhoods have also worked with the city to create CBDs, assessing themselves with a tax to provide ongoing private dollars to supplement additional streetscape improvements, street maintenance, safety services, and marketing needs that those communities feel are important. Another factor in the community's quality of life is art. Through the 2% for Art program, we've seen funding for new permanent art projects exceed $4 million. This is up from $435,000 in 2007. These investments not only create new art infrastructure for improving the quality of our neighborhoods, but it creates employment opportunities for art professionals, over half of whom are from San Francisco. The Neighborhood Arts Collaborative has funded over a dozen arts organizations deeply rooted in their neighborhoods, amounting to nearly $500,000 in just 3 years. And in addition, they've done $5 million in renovations to the Bayview Opera House and $2 million in capital improvements and facility maintenance grants funded through the Arts Commission for city-owned cultural centers. Finally, when we think about quality of life, we think about our exquisite parks and open spaces. The Recreation and Parks Department has increased revenue from the leasing of concessions and other unique partnerships, such as that with Another Planet Entertainment. In addition, the San Francisco voters have been supportive of the park system, passing a number of bond measures, while the Parks Department has worked very closely with nonprofits to provide renovations to our sports facilities and our sporting fields and community centers. And then thanks to the work of you guys, San Francisco has created other unique opportunities to provide open space to our citizens through the Pavement to Parks program, and then also our new Civic Squares and Plazas program, which will facilitate long-term activation and maintenance solutions for city-owned pedestrian plazas that fall outside of the traditional parks jurisdiction. Action Area 4 covers everything you guys do and all of your hard work. This covers everything from the robust area plans that have enabled over 75,000 units of new housing and commercial development efforts that will lead to space sufficient to support as many as 120,000 additional jobs, to your work to protect industrial space, a key piece in our efforts to ensure the retention of good middle-income jobs here in San Francisco. Your efforts with the Department of Building Inspection to improve the entitlement process, and everyone's work to address CEQA reforms, providing more certainty to project applicants and shortening the timeline for these projects, ensuring responsible development is delivered at the rate it is needed to accommodate San Francisco's growth. But as you guys often tell us, space for jobs and space for housing are just two of the key pieces of San Francisco's infrastructure. We must also pay attention to transit. The Transit Effectiveness Project is a system-wide approach to maximizing the efficiency of transit services offered by the MTA, leading to faster, more reliable commuting and greater access to jobs for San Francisco's residents. Some projects the TEP will provide include dedicated travel lanes, optimized stop locations, and transit signal priority along high ridership routes. This is on top of a number of other transit projects, including the Transbay Transit Center, Caltrain Electrification Project, Central Subway, Van Ness BRT, Geary BRT. We can keep going. The last action area is in technology and innovation. This is an area that many of our counterparts in other cities are always coming and asking us about. Just how is it that San Francisco has attracted so many innovative companies? First off, it's about our unique office product. San Francisco has been fortunate enough to attract a large number of incubators and co-working spaces, not only for technology companies, but for manufacturing and biotech as well. These spaces allow a person with an idea to give it a try without a large capital investment in a long-term lease, and provide them with a supportive, collaborative environment in which to either grow that idea, or for the business to fail, or for the entrepreneur to pivot, or whatever it is that they need to for their next step. A large number of these unique collaborative spaces have helped to engage and enable our growth as innovation capital of the world. Another key for our city is an educated workforce. The 2007 strategy emphasized this in calling for us to work to attract and expand research and academic institutions. We don't have to look any further than UCSF in Mission Bay to see that we succeeded on this. Mission Bay is the perfect example of a research institution enabling startups that then grow into large companies and create a true business cluster. As we continue to grow San Francisco's economy, we will continue to remember the importance of our academic facilities. Just take a look at Hunters Point, where one of the first declared tenants is SF State. We're at it again, focusing on continued research and talent development as an anchor for new commercial development. So this has highlighted just some of the actions taken by city departments to fulfill the recommendations of the 2007 strategy. Now Ted Egan will tell us how our economy has performed and how our policies and actions have impacted the city's performance.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Ted Egan. I'm with the Comptroller's Office of Economic Analysis. Our office was asked by OED to assist with the update to the economic strategy by providing essentially a fresh update of how the city's economy had performed. The economy, of course, changes from one day to the next, and we're obviously right now in a period of very rapid economic growth. And if you were, say, to look at the past 3 or 4 years, you would see most of the signs pointing up in terms of the San Francisco economy. But this is a strategy that's always been intended to be a long-term strategy and long-term plan. And so it's important to look at the San Francisco economy with a perspective that takes the business cycle out of the equation. In other words, looking at things from one point in the business cycle to the same point in the next business cycle. And I'll begin by sharing this finding, which is kind of a key finding from the report. It's referring to the performance of the 4 pieces of the San Francisco economy that Todd Rufo alluded to at the beginning. Basically, the creative industries, which has a lot of media and technology and architecture and consulting and innovative manufacturing industries. This is a set of activities in San Francisco that really thrive here because of the pool of talented laborers and workers that we have here, the entrepreneurial culture we have here, the funding for startup companies that we have here, and the critical mass of these activities that are already here. Secondly, we have a set of activities that we call the experience industries. This is essentially visitor attraction-related industries. This has also been a strength of the San Francisco economy for a long time, largely because of the fact that this city and this region has been is very attractive to visitors and has a lot of visitor infrastructure. Thirdly, we have a cluster of activities that we call financial and professional services. This really represents the somewhat older base of downtown San Francisco's economy, the corporate headquarters, the law firms, the financial institutions that are headquartered there. And they're largely in San Francisco because they've been in San Francisco for a long time and are still here. And then thirdly, those are the sort of 3 elements of what Todd called the export base of the economy. These all, in a sense, their performance has a large impact on the performance of the overall city's economy because based on how competitive they are, they can either do well relative to other places or do poorly. The 4th piece of the local economy, which is the biggest, is the local serving activity. And these are the businesses that serve people basically who live in San Francisco. In many ways, the fate of this industry is tied to the success of the others, but also to local factors that either do or do not support the growth of those businesses. So when I say we were taking a long-term view on this, this is a view of the performance of those industries from the 2004 to the 2010 period, essentially from the lowest point of the recession after the dot-com bust to the lowest point of the Great Recession. So we're kind of looking at 2 points in the same spot of the business cycle to see over the course of a business cycle, how have things changed? And this data really shows that they haven't changed very much. It's a continuation of trends that we've seen in San Francisco for 2 or 3 decades now. The horizontal axis here shows the average annual growth rate of the industry during that time period. So from the bottom of one recession to the bottom of the next recession, the creative industries grew over 4% a year, which is very rapid in the context of relatively slow city overall growth in that period. The experience industries grew about 1.5% a year. Financial and professional services were essentially flat. And all the local serving industries together lost jobs at the rate of about 1.5% decline per year. The vertical axis shows essentially San Francisco's relative strength in those industries, or how big that industry is in San Francisco compared to a typical U.S. place the size of San Francisco. So we have a lot of strength in creative industries, about 1.7 times what a typical U.S. place would have. We have strength in experience industries. We have strength in financial and professional services. We don't have strength in local serving industries. We have about 60% of the jobs in local serving industries that a city our size would typically have in the United States. So the local serving industry sector of our economy is sort of the weakest performing. It's losing jobs, and we have less of it than a typical city of our size would have. The relative performance of these industries, and this is a key finding, I think, in the study, goes a long way to determine the demographics of who lives in San Francisco. And the way it does that is by the types of jobs that it supports. This job, and I apologize for kind of the jarring color, but what we wanted to do was look at, for each of these industries, how do the jobs they offer line up in terms of the education that you need to work in the industry, or that employees in that industry typically have in San Francisco, and how much do they pay. And one of the key findings here is that the industries that are doing particularly well in San Francisco, the creative industries cluster and the experience industries cluster, either provide very high-paying jobs for highly educated people, or they provide low-paying jobs generally for people who don't have a lot of formal education. So I don't remember the exact number, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 75% of the jobs in the experience sector pay less than $17.50 an hour in San Francisco, which is quite low wage by the standard of living required to live in the city. The creative industries, as well as the financial and professional service industries, tend to offer more medium and particularly high wage, but most of their workers have a 4-year degree or more, and only about half the adults in San Francisco fall into that category. So there is a mismatch between the industries that are tending to grow in the city and the types of people they tend to hire and the demographics of who lives in San Francisco. And it's really that mismatch that drove the kind of perspective and objectives of the first economic strategy in 2007 and continue to, I think, inform what the city needs to do going forward. That has implications, as I said, for the demographics of who lives in San Francisco. This is a chart that shows the distribution of the city's population in 1990 and 2010 by income cohort. The income cohorts here are the usual ones that we talk about with affordable housing. Around 50% or below is extremely or very low, 50 to 80% is low, 80 to 120% is moderate, 120 to 150 is middle, and over 150 is upper. And it shows very clearly that we've had growth at the very top of the income spectrum in San Francisco, 120 and above, and we've had growth at the bottom, the 0 to 50% of income. We've had a little bit of growth in low, but then we've also grown a lot in terms of the city's overall population. We've seen a decline in the middle population. And so really the bulk of the growth in the city's population is at the top and the bottom, and I think that's reflective of the fact that the industries that are growing in San Francisco tend to hire people at the top of the bottom. I don't think that that's should be very surprising. The ballot measure that created the economic development plan requirement for OED also required it to do something called a barriers to job growth survey, which is essentially a survey of businesses to identify the factors in the city's business climate that discourage them from hiring jobs. We supplemented this with our analytical work to look at how the cost of doing business in San Francisco for different types of businesses is different than it is in other places within the Bay Area. And this is just one slide to highlight this. And I apologize on the video that the different colors don't show up, but basically both the survey and the kind of cost analysis that we did pointed to 3 factors that are particularly contribute to a high cost of doing business in San Francisco. The first and far away the most important is labor costs. They tend to be the biggest expense that businesses pay. Most businesses spend most of their revenue on labor, or many do. And San Francisco's labor costs are higher than a business has to pay to hire someone in other parts of the Bay Area. That shows up in the blue here. The second cost factor for businesses is their space cost. That also tends to be higher in San Francisco. For most businesses, it's quite less of a factor than labor costs. And the third is taxes. And taxes are higher in San Francisco than they are in other places, but this is a distant third. There are relatively few businesses who have higher cost of doing business in San Francisco because of taxes. It's almost always because their labor costs are higher or because their office space costs are higher. Now, this is an example that we put together of what a typical hardware store would pay in labor costs and in office costs and in taxes in San Francisco and some other places around the Bay Area. And compared, for example, to the East Bay, San Francisco is quite a bit higher. Now, you may say, well, people don't decide to go to Oakland if they need to go to the hardware store, and businesses have higher costs, but they also have a local kind of a captive market. And that's true, but it's probably less and less true than it is before. First of all, there is a lot of leakage out of San Francisco to places in other parts of the area where costs are lower and therefore commodities are lower. And secondly, businesses are not just competing with nearby jurisdictions, but they're also increasingly competing with online sources, particularly in the retail space. So I think what this business barrier work suggests is that when you look at the industries that don't have a natural competitive advantage in San Francisco, that can't necessarily bear the high cost of doing business, the fact that it's more expensive in San Francisco probably is connected to the fact that they're not growing and thriving in San Francisco, and that it really is a question of addressing some of these barriers over the long term, so that we won't have an economy in which two or three of the sectors are doing well, but in fact all four of the sectors are doing well. And on that note, I'll turn it over to Todd for a conclusion.
Commissioners, to close on the formal report, and I'm eager to get to your questions as well as the public comment. I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about the next steps and where the conclusions of this update are sort of directing us. As Ted mentioned, there are remaining challenges to achieving the three goals that I laid out in the beginning, and we've laid out the seven here. The first, obviously, is a focus on the development of more housing, particularly affordable housing, and this one goes to the heart of, I think, that last bar chart about the hardware store and the cost that hardware store or any other business doing business in San Francisco, the cost that they face because of the high cost of housing, and how that translates into wages that they have to pay on a comparative basis with other cities. So that remains an absolute focus. We can talk more. This commission knows well all the work that's being done in that area. Would enjoy the opportunity to discuss that further, obviously. We also need to continue to develop career pathways that promote job mobility and advancement. And that really speaks to one of the middle slides that Ted showed about wages and how those wages are driven by education level and then overlaid by the industries that create those particular jobs. And a simpler way of saying that would be we need to ensure that all residents, particularly those with barriers to employment, whether they may not have graduated from high school or maybe they have a record, we need to ensure that those residents have multiple pathways to employment and increasing levels of wages so that they're not just stagnating at the bottom of the economy and exacerbating the bar chart that Ted showed of low, middle, and higher income earners. Number three is really about streamlining business regulation and process. This is pretty straightforward. OEWD, in working with the Department of Technology and the Office of Small Business, continues to implement the small business portal and to further streamline business permitting and regulation for starting businesses and growing businesses. We obviously need to address rising real estate costs and lack of space in the city. This is an issue that this commission knows all too well. I'm sure there'll be a robust discussion about that. We need to be really focused on our local serving industries, and particularly not just PDR industries, but also our local serving businesses, small businesses in the commercial corridor, which, as Ted was showing, we're underperforming in that area. We could be doing a lot more, and I think the commission has done a great job of prioritizing not just PDR, but also supporting our local businesses. Number six is about transportation infrastructure capacity. This kind of goes without saying, the importance of being able to move people not just within the city, but also into the city and out of the city, and then also considerations for movement of employees and customers late at night as well. And finally, there were four conclusions of the original economic strategy, which continue to be true. We need to continue to strengthen our physical infrastructure sectors, the distribution sector, the transportation sectors, the PDR industries. We need to continually upgrade the experience sector. Tourism is a key driver of the city's economy. We need to retain our larger knowledge sector companies because they're not just providing strong employment growth directly, but provide strong multiplier in indirect spending that pulses through the rest of the economy. And finally, we need to continue to be a great place to start a new business, whether it's a knowledge-based startup or a new hardware store or a new nonprofit organization. San Francisco's most compelling advantage is it's a great place to take a new idea to market, and we need to continually be a competitive location for that. So with that, we'll bring this portion to a close. Looking forward to the discussion, questions, and public comment.
Thank you very much. Opening it up to public comment, there's one card at Tom Radulovich. Tom, are you still here? Okay. Is there any other public comment? Okay, public comments closed. Let me just start off with a couple of thoughts. And, you know, it's always interesting that what I think is some of the most interesting informational items, there's very little or no public comment. But this one, to me, is quite possibly, out of all the reports and packets we get, the most important, the most comprehensive, because it looks at housing, job creation, transit, et cetera, down the line. I want to thank you for putting this all together, the entire team. You know, to me, I think we, with the 2007 and then this year's report, have a pretty good baseline and beginning to even get a better baseline of where we want to take this and what we want to see in the next report a few years from now. Mr. Egan had mentioned some, you know, mismatches and barriers here, and I think from at least my perspective, and I think this commission's perspective, if we can try to help identify what those barriers are, what those mismatches are, using this data to help us make better informed decisions and guide the city to where we think we might be a little bit soft or too strong. Commissioner Richards had mentioned earlier in a comment about market rate housing and affordable housing and what's the balance, and, you know, are we off balance? There's been other comments about office allocation and the concept of a three-legged stool, transit, housing, and job creation. So I'm very interested to see, and Mr. Rufo had mentioned the next steps here, but really where we take this data, how we digest it now that we've got it here, how we make a plan of action going forward to try to bring other groups that are very much involved and have a stake in this city, and how we get them on board to all come together, at least 80% to go the right direction. The same direction is important to me. So I'll curious to hear what other commissioners say. Commissioner Antonini.
Thank you. Very interesting report. Very well done. One thing I did want to comment at the beginning, when we were talking about how we work with businesses and with individuals to help them with their needs. That's very important, but the emphasis seemed to be on existing residents, existing businesses. I think we have to outreach too, throughout the country or even the world, to businesses that might not be here, and what can we do to get you here? I remember I talked to a hotel chain when I was in Chicago, and I tried to see if we could get them to build their hotel here, because it's a wonderful hotel and it would fit very well in San Francisco. And there are many businesses that people in San Francisco will drive long distances to go to because we don't have them in San Francisco, and they don't care if they have to drive to Palo Alto or someplace to get there, or other places, because they like the particular business, and the same is true of businesses that are located elsewhere. And so we have to be not only supportive of what's here, but supportive of what we could get in the future to help us improve our economy and stop people from spending money outside of San Francisco. And, you know, most businesses would love to be in San Francisco. So we always kind of have an adversarial relationship, particularly with Formula Retail, but we have to weigh that against the business it can bring in. What was very disturbing when the surveys, which are part of this report, said that 75% of those surveyed said that the business climate was either average or poor or terrible in San Francisco, and we have to find out why we have such a low rating. Only 25% said good or excellent. And then they went into the various factors that people said were barriers for them being here, which one would assume are often the reasons, although sometimes there's subtle reasons that they don't necessarily mention. When you talked about quality of life, I mean, many people don't want to have businesses here because they have to deal with undesirable factors that are around where their businesses are. Homelessness, of course, it's a problem everywhere, but it seems most noticeable in San Francisco compared to other parts of the Bay Area, in my opinion, and some of the other antisocial activities that go on in San Francisco streets that you have to step over or avoid to be able to get to work. So this is something we have to be frank with the people we ask, and what are you really talking about? But in terms of the tangible things you came up with, the good news is I think most of these are controllable. Obviously, tax and licensing, the various things we have in San Francisco, we may not want to change those, but they're within our control, and we've done a little bit already by moving from payroll to gross receipts. But the cost of rental space is something that I think we can control if we start to think logically about the ability to build new office space in San Francisco. In the 80s, we had a boom. And unfortunately, in my opinion, we passed legislation which made it impossible to enough office space to be built to match the demand. So builders went to suburban office parks because they could build it a lot more cheaply there, and they, with the BART and other things being established, and they were able to attract businesses even sometimes reluctantly to these areas. And then what happened is the cost of the existing office space skyrocketed because we weren't creating enough. And we're in the same situation now, that builders want to build commercial space here, businesses want to be here, employees often live here already, and we could do ourselves and the whole Bay Area a lot of good by providing enough office space for all these reverse commuters, because many firms would rather be in San Francisco than where they currently are located, or at least high percentages of their employees would be relocated here. So we have to look carefully at this Prop M problem and pass whatever measures necessary to address reality and not shoot ourselves in the foot, or, when we're on the verge of a lot of success by making these artificial restrictions. And even the housing problem, which drives up the costs of employees. I mean, if we do work with other agencies in the Bay Area for transit solutions, such as a second BART tube, other things that will bring San Francisco the natural center for business in the Bay Area, people easily in here. Unfortunately, even the outlying areas close to San Francisco are pretty expensive to live in, but they're noticeably less than San Francisco. And, not everyone who works here is going to be able to live here. We want to build as much housing as we possibly can at all levels, because people would prefer to live here close to their jobs. And if we can do that, even middle income or upper middle income housing, a lot of people leave San Francisco because of other factors that we don't analyze, such as the perceived quality of public schools, because of the lack of large enough housing to accommodate families in an individual envelope. And so those are things we really have to work on to meet those problems. What was also very disappointing was the retail industry reported a very low attraction level, which retail is another leg of our whole business community that we didn't really emphasize, but people historically come to San Francisco to shop. And they will come for the uniqueness of the San Francisco product. They can go to shopping centers throughout the Bay Area, but they see the same stores that they see anywhere else. But if you want to go to either a really exclusive high-end store, even a unique local store such as Valencia or Hayes or all these streets, I mean, that's a San Francisco experience, and we have to make sure we are supportive of retail, because obviously that particular group feels the climate is not very good for them. And the good news was, I think retaining employees did not seem to be as much of a problem for many of the groups, because people do want to be in San Francisco. There's cultural activities, there's educational, there's health activities, there's entertainment activities, and all these things make it a natural place for people to want to live and especially work, because even if they don't live here, they can avail themselves of all these things. That's why we see a big boost in attendance when the Giants built their stadium China Basin because people could leave work and go right to the ball game. It was a lot easier than having to drive out to Candlestick, and the same will probably occur when the Warriors build their arena. The concert attendance will be very attractive because people are already here for other reasons. So the other thing I think you need to look at is asking businesses who used to be in San Francisco and are still in the Bay Area in particular, but even those who've relocated elsewhere, what were the real factors that drove you out of San Francisco? And I think that will be instructive to do things that will keep firms from leaving. You know, I talked a little bit about quality of life. I think important with transit is coordinate. There doesn't seem to be a coordination of transit in the Bay Area. It's like BART does certain things, Muni does certain things, Samtrans, Caltrans, all these things are sort of moving independent of each other, and nobody really sits down, even with reference to San Francisco, seeing what's the best way to bring rapid transit to, let's say, the Richmond district. Should we go down Geary? Should we go tunnel through the hills? There's all kinds of, you know, interesting ways it could be done, and nobody's really thinking outside the box or trying to think about what makes the most sense. That really has to happen. And so I think that, you know, it's a good report, but those are some of the areas that I see that need to be worked on, and if we address the different things that I talked about today and what the other commissioners will bring up, I think we can reach a lot of our problems in term. And we have to also stop the attitude. There's a lot of this in San Francisco that's kind of them or us. It's like the people who live here now are us, and anybody who wants to live here is them. And there's this sort of, you know, antagonism between people who want to live in the city. We should be welcoming people to move to San Francisco, especially if they work here already. And we should try to figure out the best ability to match up residents with the jobs or create jobs that will, you know, be good for the residents that, you know, want to live here, and see if it works. I think the forces are already there. Everything is in motion. What we have to do is just harness those and treat them in the right way instead of being antagonistic towards certain groups in San Francisco. The newcomers are somehow bad people because, you know, they're new, and that's not a good way to look at how things are. Thank you.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thanks. Yeah, just a couple things. Thank you, Mr. Rufo and OED and Mr. Egan for a wonderful presentation. Just a couple of quick things. I appreciate that you preempted my my plug that I usually do for the Transit Effectiveness Project program, and also for how the development of large-scale commercial spaces in the Southeast is really going to change some of the equation of where jobs are and even where the wage levels are. So I appreciate you preempting me having to talk about that, so I'll just keep it really short. One thing that I heard during the course of the presentation was, you know, you have these four or five different policy areas, and one area was pointed out as, okay, here's the place where the Planning Commission, this is where you guys work, which is the infrastructure piece. And I just want to hang on that just for just 1 second and say, and plug yet another thing that I usually talk about, which is development agreements. I feel like there are many elements about keeping businesses, especially businesses, service entities like nonprofits and residents in San Francisco that are connected to real estate and connected to land use, but aren't directly related to the structure of a building or what kind of building it is or what kind of zoning we have, which is kind of where we oftentimes, that's our bailiwick and oftentimes the tools that we have. I think you can use development agreements in a lot of ways to encourage what you want to see, which is space for smaller companies, space for nonprofits, space for neighborhood serving services. We talk about the sector academies, and I think one of the things that we can take away as a lesson from, I'll plug this, Hope SF, is those sorts of academies and other sorts of city-provided services are much more effective when they're close to where the people are. And Hope SF, in its toddler stages now, is effective because those services are right there in the community services, right there in the middle of where people live. And we need to think about how can we integrate that into other multifamily housing or other larger communities that are being built out that aren't Hope SF, that aren't public housing and we don't have as much control over. And I think you can get that by talking more about development agreements because, we can't make a zone that says you have to have these neighborhoods serving services here. And I don't even think that would be the best approach. But you can look at every project and say, here are the elements that make a successful community. Here are the elements that make a more equitable community and use development agreements to get there rather than trying to legislate everything and create zoning that controls everything. So that's just my plug for that. I also want to make a plug again, talking, sort of going off of the idea of development agreements as a way to get what the types of growth that you want to see in different communities. I definitely saw in the report, it was very interesting. I'm not going to preempt Commissioner Richards' comments because he actually talked about this in the beginning. But we want to see more middle income jobs. And when you have, you cannot have a successful community with such a double barrel sort of handle-shaped economy. You can't. You're not going to have success. Things are going to fall apart in the end, especially when you have any sort of stressors to the economy. And the one way to get that I saw in the report that was outlined was that you need to start having these companies that are starting up here in all sectors age in place because. Yes, you start out with the high wage, sort of higher educational requirement jobs, but as those companies grow, then they start to need more of those middle income jobs. And I thought that was a very good and interesting point that was brought up in the report. And you can, again, use development agreements to help companies age in place so that you can have more of that natural wage growth over a cycle rather than trying to ram it through by mandating different types of zoning for different types of jobs up front. You want to encourage that sort of natural cycle of the growth of firms and the growth of companies. So I definitely appreciate that. And again, my comments are short because you guys preempted a lot of the things that I normally say about economic development in San Francisco. So thank you very much.
I want to thank everyone for the report. I wanted to ask on this chart if we could see the raw numbers of the job increases in these 4 areas over the last, it was 2004 to 2010. It doesn't have to be right now, but if you could maybe send it to the Commission Secretary.
We certainly could do that, Commissioner.
Thank you. I think in the report it had sort of the total number of jobs that we have now, but specifically I'm looking for the addition in 2004 through 2010. Looking back at the goals that were set out in 2007, especially the one around inclusion and equity, not for lack of trying, but I think in many ways we have not achieved that goal, especially looking at the chart that shows we have very high income and very low income people now. I think that one thing I would like to see in the conclusion then is that we really focus efforts on boosting the local industries. I know it was already in the conclusion, but more effort on all of the sort of industries in there. It's not just PDR. I saw construction, I saw real estate, I saw a number of different areas. So it's not just one slice, but it's everything that's local serving. And also from the chart that showed the wages correlated to education, I think that's really where we have the opportunity to get better wages to people who do not have the level of education that is required for the creative industry jobs. Also, in your conclusions, you talked about the role of costs, and I think we are seeing so much around how difficult it is to locate your small business or nonprofit in San Francisco right now. I am really encouraged by the work that we're doing on legacy business. I think that some of the more creative ideas around possibly allowing the rights for a co-op of business owners to buy their retail space or to look at other ways to stabilize those businesses. I think that line of thinking has been strong, and I would hope that we can continue to look in that direction. I'm interested in what Commissioner Johnson had to say. I think that this question of whether or not the multiplier effect works, I question it because we've seen this huge disparity in income since 2004. But maybe it is the longer that businesses stay here, the more people in those businesses, their actual wages increase, and that they could start to earn more of a middle income wage. But I think that we want to be careful about saying that just because we have all of these creative industry jobs, that there are good jobs that come with it. Maybe there really is only a janitor job for now, and so what multiplier effect are we really getting out of it? Thank you.
Commissioner Richards.
Thank you very much. Actually, I had to scratch my head when you mentioned Prop I. Excuse me, still fighting a cold. I actually voted for it. I now recall it. This is incredible work. I think for the average San Franciscan, this got lost over the last decade. And somehow, if we can kind of publish all that's been done, would do a great service to your organization and to this city. Impressed what's here. It's refreshingly truthful in that you're calling a spade a spade. We have these issues. We got to tackle them. These are inhibiting, the business climate and growth. I think in the 7 action areas you have, we've got a plan, and we're doing fairly well in 5 of the 7. The 2 big ones, obviously, are real estate cost and then the affordable housing, or the balance of affordable housing to the jobs. I think it looks like jobs are shrinking in that sector. Housing opportunities are also shrinking in that sector. So I heard a dumbbell effect being created. I actually call it the donut hole. We have this big kind of donut hole in the middle, and I don't want to live or have the city become a tale of 2 cities, where it's extremely rich or extremely not rich. But I do think we still have a disconnect between jobs and housing here. We just approved a housing element 2 weeks ago, or we recommended it be adopted by the board, and it called for 61% affordability on all new construction. Yet, week after week after week, we fool ourselves by approving big projects in the 12 to 18% affordable range. So every time we approve a big project, we're falling further and further behind where we need to be. So, let's not fool ourselves. Let's make sure that whatever we come up with the mayor's task force on housing helps move that needle a lot closer to where we need to be, and helps the economy in all sectors become balanced. I think the jobs multiplier effect is an interesting one. I came from a very large tech company, and we had a large multiplier effect, and we had to struggle. We struggled with actually keeping some of the services that we wanted here in the city, because the services that they're in that $70 to $35 an hour range had a hard time staying here. So we were constantly actually going out, either domestically. We're looking at areas like Detroit and Kentucky and all these places where the wages are much lower, and they actually have a great workforce. But one of the things that actually got us to move a good portion of our jobs in those ranges away was turnover. So, we had the jobs, but we had people that were struggling to exist here, and we had a high turnover, and eventually we just threw our hands up and said, forget it. We'll just have to source this kind of activity from somewhere else. So that's a big issue. I think to Commissioner Antonini's comment on Prop M, to the best of my knowledge, the first time we're hitting the cap is coming up. So I don't think we've been preventing office space from being built. We just haven't hit the cap yet. And I think once we figure out what the criteria is, we're going to get some good projects, and it's going to actually help a balanced economy and have a balanced view of things. So very good work. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Commissioner Hillis.
I second my fellow commissioners. This report's helpful in giving us we hear a lot of this anecdotally every week when we talk about projects, but giving us kind of the data behind it in kind of a very factual way. A question for Mr. Rufo. Getting to the conclusions that are here, and I agree with Commissioner Richards, there's a couple we're not quite meeting, and I would throw infrastructure kind of capacity in there, or transportation infrastructure. But many of them cost money, right? In especially affordable housing, the cost per unit is staggeringly high. Increasing job training in transit infrastructure are huge amounts to increase that infrastructure. And it doesn't seem like the city's budget, even though the economy is growing, it's seemingly leaps and bounds that it's growing kind of equally. And it was interesting, Director Ram noted, there's not a ton of people who ranked taxes and being dissatisfied with taxes as high. So how do you fund those? I mean, where does the funding come from if not from the city budget? Is there an opportunity to increase revenue sources and taxes in the city to help pay for these needs that we identify? We hear them every week. You've identified them, that I think are critical.
There's a lot in that question. I think I take it in a couple of different pieces. going back to sort of the 2007 report, number 3 of the priorities of why we do economic development strategies is to ensure that the city has strong fiscal footing. I believe the city's budget, it's not my core area of expertise, but I believe the city's budget is at or near the highest it's ever been in its history, which is a reminder that in order for us to be able to fund our priorities, the city needs to have a strong economy to fund those things. And to get to many of the commissioners' points about inequality, having those resources gives us the ability to tackle those challenges. And so as we face the question, is there too much success? Is there too much economic growth? Well, the economic development director and workforce development director would say, having that economic growth gives you the resources to be able to tackle those challenges relative to other cities elsewhere in the country that are experiencing economic stagnant growth, who don't have the resources to be able to tackle those challenges. So sort of fundamentally start with that point. I think to your question about, are there other opportunities to bring more money into the fold to tackle some of these challenges? You referenced transportation. I think about one of the housing recommendations, and Sarah Dennis Phillips is here as well today, that looks at a fund to help to support affordable housing development in the city. I think we've seen the type of giving that's happening within the tech community and other business philanthropic community to tackle many of these large policy challenges, again, along the themes of more resources coming in to tackle many of the fundamental competitiveness challenges that I see affecting the city's economy. I would leave sort of the question of, is there appetite for more taxation in one area or another to policymakers as well as to voters who in some cases would have to approve that. But I would say that there are a fair amount of resources that are going in to tackle many of these challenges today. Could there be more that would help? Of course. And I think, though, that the resources that our department at least has to tackle many of these challenges is, I think, making a difference.
Okay, that's helpful. Because we see, what we see every week is market rate housing, right? And we focus on that, like somehow that's either going to solve or, affect the problem. Whereas, we can generate revenue from market rate housing, not a ton, to help affordable housing. But I think we often miss the broader picture. If we're going to fund affordable housing or transit at the level we need to fund it to make an impact, it's got to go beyond kind of impact fees on market rate housing to more broader, bonds or parcel tax type, broader type taxes in order to do it. I just don't think kind of focusing on market rate housing as it goes up and down is ever going to be enough to kind of solve some of the problems we have. And that's what we tend to focus on. So it's good to get this to kind of look bigger picture at the issues and potential sources of funding. So thanks.
Okay.
Commissioner Wu.
I just wanted to add on some things that I thought that the planning department staff could do to liaison with this report. I think when we were looking at housing element just a couple weeks ago, there were a lot of questions around jobs and wages and what's the intersection with housing. And so I think that generally, I guess I have the suggestion that we try to incorporate this data or work closely with OEWD when we're doing both housing element type work, I know we just passed it, and the Commerce and Industry report, because I think this report does really start to answer a lot of questions that we often have. And the second thing is on this question of these local serving industry businesses, is there any kind of planning code correlation? I know we've talked a lot about PDR, but is it that we have so many categories of types of businesses in the planning code? Are there certain ones that would fall very squarely within this local serving industry, and is there anything we can do to make it easier for those type of businesses to succeed?
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick things. Commissioner Hillis, definitely agree with a lot of his questions and comments about financing, and I would just say that this goes beyond OEWD. I think there needs to be a larger discussion around should we be using sort of enhanced financing tools like
enhance infrastructure financing districts and other ways to sort of get at that sort of tax increment, parcel tax sort of idea. We're not going to get it all through sort of impact fees, even though I'm still going to plug development agreements. I'll just keep saying it until they start happening all the time. So just want to say that real quick. And then, Mr. Radulovich, real quick, you were the only one who had public comment. And I want to ask the chair, would it be okay for him to talk for a couple minutes? He's on our BART board,
I think
Liberal Cities.
You can ask him, yeah.
Mr. Radulovich.
Yeah, I can answer questions. Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
you missed public comments. I didn't know
Right.
if there was anything in general that you had to add to the conversation, particularly around transit or other areas that we were discussing.
I did miss public comment. I appreciate the call. I was interested in the questions of transit capacity, and that is certainly very much on our minds over at BART. You know, seeing all this extraordinary growth in the downtown, we need the infrastructure to support that. And I think we're nearly at the point, unfortunately, where we're going to have to start commenting on the EIRs and EISs of downtown office building projects and saying, we can't bring any more people through Embarcadero Station or Montgomery Station or through that tube unless we start making some investments. So I think the infrastructure discussion is a great one, and Director Antonini and others have talked about how we need to be talking a lot more together. The city has been very reluctant to invest in BART capacity. You know, we have a transit impact development fee, so it's a fee on new development. We've had that for a few decades. Not a penny has gone to BART for additional BART capacity. So we used all the capacity that we bought when we built the original BART system. Now, as each new project comes in, we have to pay for that incremental new. And so we need to figure out a way to do that. I understand that there's reluctance to raise taxes, but things like impact fees is one. I think the city working together with AC Transit, BART, et cetera, on a bridge toll measure. So if we did a congestion charge on the bridge toll and really investing that, not like RM2 did, which was a lot of extensions in the suburbs, you know, fourth tunnels on Caldecott, all of that, but really core system capacity, BART, Muni, AC Transit, getting folks across the Bay Bridge corridor. That's another area where I could see us really working well together. So I know the TIDF and those Nexus fee conversations, hopefully will come back to you. That is something you as a commission do. And looking at, okay, well, what capital needs and capacity needs do we have to have in those plans to make sure that growth is paying for growth, and that we're building the infrastructure we need to sustain those additional trips. That's something that a conversation we should have sooner rather than later, considering the way that we're growing and the number of projects being approved that won't pay these fees if we don't update it. But yeah, I think this is a great conversation, and thinking about it, you know, not only multi-agency, but, you know, kind of multi-jurisdiction, going out to the regional agencies and saying, what should we be doing? The other thing, of course, would be San Francisco does have a seat at regional bodies like ABAG and MTC, and I think sending a very clear message as a city about what the city needs to be this economic engine that it is for the region, from the region, would be really helpful. The city doesn't often speak in one voice and with clarity and in kind of a strategic way, and I think this conversation today could be the beginning of that. So how is the city representing itself and its needs in these regional forums is another thing. So it's a great conversation, and look forward to working with all the folks here to make these various things happen.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Richards.
One question for Mr. Egan. I was at this forum last night in the Mission, and you know, all these ideas came up around how to fund affordable housing, transportation, et cetera. And I think parlaying on Commissioner Hillis's comments, one of the ones that came up actually got me thinking, and I'm not sure if you've ever considered this or modeled this or even mentioned this, is potentially asking the state for some relief vis-a-vis some reform of Prop 13. Has that ever been bandied about, considered, modeled?
It's not something I've been aware of, Commissioner.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Radulovich and others. I think these suggestions are all great ones. Bond issues. In the past, a lot of bond issues for affordable housing and even infrastructure have failed, but I think the climate is different, and the time may be right for a large bond issue or bond issues, particularly with the concern about housing, to provide monies for housing, because, as was stated, market rate housing is only going to provide a percentage towards affordable, and It does do many good things because it creates housing for a growing workforce. People at Twitter, other companies that can afford to pay this would be competing with the existing residents for existing housing were we not building new housing. They're not going to go away. They're here and they'll just compete for existing. But as far as addressing the large picture, we will probably need something like bond issue or bridge tolls for transportation, which Mr. Radulovich brought up, which makes a lot of sense. Instead of building these lines of BART out to some place where have very small populations in distant areas and they have their own BART station, we should be working on infra-city BART extensions and the second tube. And ABAG and the Bay Area Council are places where we had to advocate for our needs because everybody seems to be happy to have jobs here. They want to be here, and they have to help us to meet our needs by being creative and giving us funding. And we have to vote our own funding and not one who votes a lot for higher taxes, but I would certainly be in favor of bond issues for affordable housing or infrastructure that address our needs, and would encourage all of my friends to vote in favor of those.
Director Ram.
Thanks. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and for all the comments. I think this, the economic, I think while the planning department is often seen as having kind of a small piece of this puzzle, I think the lesson for me and for us is that we can't just focus on kind of individual buildings and individual development projects. I mean, we clearly have to broaden our perspective on how we do business and be more aware of the other factors that affect how we do our work and vice versa, and how our work affects the economic growth of the city. Just a couple of comments on comments that were made. I think, number one, the city, in my experience, is working more regionally now than we ever have. The mayor has established strong relationships with the mayors of San Jose and Oakland. We have been working very hard directly with our counterparts in Oakland, and I think there is much greater sense now than there ever has been in this region of the need to think regionally on all these issues. Obviously, infrastructure and transportation is a key one, but issues of affordable housing and so on are now much more being perceived as regional issues. And then if I could just get on my soapbox for a minute about the federal government and the challenges that we all face, because just in the years that I've been working as a city planner, the federal government's contribution to local infrastructure projects has gone from about 80% funding to about 40 or 30% funding. So the challenges are huge because the feds have simply gotten out of the business of supporting cities and regions on these efforts. And that includes affordable housing in a big way. So we are all forced, and I hear this constantly from my counterparts in other cities, we are all forced to go it alone in terms of funding for these two major pieces of our needs. And it's an enormous challenge when you're talking about the dollars that we're talking about here. So I just would, urge us all to think about the kind of regional consequences of the federal government getting out of the business of supporting local regions and infrastructure and housing, and to maybe think more creatively about how we can address that problem.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Commissioners, we're going to take one more item as the court reporter's here, and then we'll take a break.
Very good, Commissioners. That would put us on item 10 for case number 2012.0877E at 1546 through 1564 Market Street. This is a draft environmental impact report. Please note that written comments will be accepted at the Planning Department until 5 p.m. on March 2nd, 2015.
Good afternoon, President Fong, members of the Commission. I'm Brett Bollinger, Planning Department staff and EII coordinator for the 1546 to 1564 Market Street project. Joining me is Chris Kern, senior environmental planner. Members of the project sponsors team are also present. The item before you is review and comment on the 1546 to 1564 Market Street draft EIR, case number 2012.0877E. The proposed project would develop residential and ground floor commercial uses on the project site located in the Market and Octavia neighborhood plan area. The project would demolish 3 existing buildings and construct a new 12-story, 120-foot tall mixed-use building. The proposed building would contain 109 residential units, 4,810 square feet of ground floor commercial space, 28 parking spaces, and 110 bicycle parking spaces in a below-grade parking garage. A notice of availability for a community plan exemption and notice of preparation of an EIR were issued on October 22, 2014. The Planning Department determined that an EIR must be prepared for the proposed project since the community plan exemption identified potential significant physical and environmental effects related to historical architectural resource impacts that were not previously identified in the Market Octavia Plan EIR. Other environmental impacts of the proposed project were adequately disclosed in the Market Octavia Area Plan Final EIR as documented in the community plan exemption that was attached to the notice of preparation. The draft EIR found that the proposed project would result in a significant avoidable impacts on individual historical resources. The draft EIR analyzed 4 alternatives: the no project alternative, the full preservation alternative, the market partial preservation alternative, and the oak partial preservation alternative. The no project alternative and the full preservation alternative would avoid the project's significant and unavoidable historic resource impacts. The 2 reduced preservation alternatives would reduce the project's impacts on historical resources compared with the proposed project, but not to a less than significant level. The draft EIR was published on January 7, 2015, and the public review period closes on March 2, 2015. On February 4, 2015, the Historic Preservation Commission, HPC, held a public hearing and took public comment on the draft environmental impact report. After discussion at the hearing, the HPC arrived at the following questions and comments. The first one is, the HPC is concerned that the proposed project would result in the loss of 2 historic resources on the proposed project site. The HPC is most concerned with the loss of the 55 Oak Street building, which appears to be more architecturally distinctive of the 2 historic resources on the proposed project site. The second, the HPC recommends that the FEIR include an additional partial preservation alternative that incorporates large-scale vertical additions on top of the historical buildings with substantial setbacks or similar projects. The HPC believes that such an alternative could allow for preservation of some of the features of the historic buildings on the site while providing for the development of a higher number of housing units than the alternatives included in the draft EIR. Staff is not here to respond to any comments at today's draft EIR hearing. Comments will be transcribed and responded to in writing in the comments and responses document, which will respond to all verbal and written comments received and make revisions to the draft EIR as appropriate. Comments today should be directed towards the adequacy and accuracy of the information contained in the draft EIR. For members of the public who are here today, please state your name for the record. For those who are interested in commenting on the draft EIR in writing, by mail, or email, they may submit their comments to the Environmental Review Officer at 1650 Mission Street, Suite 400, by 5 p.m. on March 2nd. When the response to comments document is complete, the Planning Department will provide copies to those who have commented on the draft EIR. We will then return to the Commission to request certification of the EIR. If the EIR is certified, the Planning Commission may consider approval of the project. This concludes my presentation, and unless commissioners have questions, I would recommend that the Commission open public hearing on this item. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any public comment? Yeah. So, seeing no public comment, Commissioner Moore.
The EIR is interesting in the way it's set up. It's very clear. There are just a number of areas where I believe there are missing pieces, partially as information pieces. I would say there should be a summary of the Market Octavia EIR findings, which deal particularly with these sites. The Market Octavia plan for these sites was rather vague, and we commented on that and had lots of discussions. In most cases, there were indications of taller buildings, which were depicted as little asterisks. They never went much further than that. And that is, for me, a very important question, because what we have is cumulative effects and no discussion at all how buildings which are close by, actually on the adjoining parcel as an additional other tall building, is not being discussed at all in context, even as a physical simulation for ideas which would have come out of the Market Octavia plan. There is something amiss for me, which raises the issue of being very, very critical in terms of how we look at the necessity of historic preservation alternatives, how we need to look at massing relative to adjoining buildings and projects nearby, which is the Honda side, as well as potentially the change of settings through the very large project, which will be on the Goodwill side. I believe that there is a district transformation which is not properly addressed when we look at this EIR only focused on one building. I don't think this is a moment to recall that a few minutes ago we talked about the effect that this project will primarily focus on building housing, which is not necessarily in the category of affordable housing, but that is not part of I think, of what this EIR has to account on anyway. The second point of what I am missing is, and I'm not sure because it's part of a larger EIR, there are no view simulations. I believe that the effect of aggregating two lots in north-south direction could have potentially a visual effect I would be concerned about, together with no adjoining buildings, even in broad massing being brought into this EIR. So lack of visual simulations looking in east-west, east direction, looking in western direction, particularly towards the civic center. We have a historic district. We used to use City Hall as a mark on the skyline, which we needed to see, with tall buildings now starting to affect the gateway at Market and Van Ness. This and adjoining buildings will affect of how we look or don't look towards City Hall anymore. So missing cumulative massing. What surprises me is, unfortunately, the intersection of Market and Van Ness is probably, from my experience, one of the worst intersections along two very powerful streets, one being Market, the other one being Van Ness. But what we have is, from a traffic point, is one of the most inefficient and almost non-workable intersections because the intersection is too large. There are too many modes, some of which are not very compatible. Pedestrian safety and ease of pedestrian movement is as absolutely zero, and there is nothing which any of these projects are doing to address improvements of that situation, but what they rather will do is make it even worse. Access to public transportation, access to BART in front of these buildings is probably one of the worst places to get into the BART station itself. When I come to the department, I walk down Van Ness. I sometimes come with BART. And each time I have to do it, it is absolutely horrible, and I believe the EIR needs to elaborate on that particular aspect. Cumulative wind effects. Each project in the general area of the intersection of Market and Mission is already in its current state at wind velocities which are bordering being unsafe. I do not see a discussion about that. And that is, I think, at this moment, these are my comments. I would support historic preservation in further elaborations on other alternatives which deal with the historic buildings. The one which was read into the record is a very interesting one. Alternative 3 is interesting, but I think there is more.
Commissioner Antonini.
I would agree with much of what Commissioner Moore said. It looks like Alternative 4 might be close to what the Historic Preservation Commission was talking about as a partial preservation alternative. It seems to preserve 55 Oak and separates the buildings to some degree. But there might be further ramifications or alternatives of that preservation alternative which might be worth discussing in comments and responses to comments to see what they actually were interested in. Because I think this is a very important building, and all these new buildings that are going to be built along Market will sort of dominate the area there. And we have some historic districts, the Mason Tree District right near there, Hayes Valley Civic Center District, and I think although this is only a massing study that comes in the EIR, it's very important that this be carefully articulated and presented in such a way to be contextual as much as possible with what's existing there. Oftentimes, a building can be designed in such a way by the use of materials that are complementary to what's already there and make the building less offensive visually by the architect doing it in the right way, and we have a very good architect, in my opinion, on this project, so I think that's a later stage. But as far as the analysis so far, I would say the area that probably needs more attention is the partial preservation alternative.
Commissioner Richards.
I actually left my DEIR in my airplane bag. I read this on the airplane when I came back from the East Coast, but I read it cover to cover, but I'll cover the major points and I'll send the rest of my comments in via email. I agree with what both commissioners have already said. I'm really looking for kind of this building in context to all the other developments that have been mentioned. I'm having a hard time envisioning how it's going to sit and what it's going to look like. So some type of a 3D contextual of the area with the proposed developments in the pipeline would really be helpful. I did have a question, and we mentioned these kind of comments as well on, I think it was 1333 Goff, the wind cumulative effects, the traffic cumulative effects of all these other developments. So this is something I think we've already gone record on other DEIRs asking for. One thing that really struck me as odd was how conclusions were drawn on the financing availability of 58 units or 68 units. I mean, I come from the upper market, and there's 50-unit projects all the time being built up there, and financing's available. So how and where did a financing conclusion enter into the discussion on that financing would not be available for the partial preservation alternatives? That concerns me. So I'd like to understand where those comments both came from on both of those. I mentioned this on, I'm losing track of my addresses, 1455 or 1545 Pine. We mentioned here taxpayer block structures. I have no context if I vote to support a project to demolish one because I don't understand what the census is on how many there are left. So, you talked in the DEIR about the one on Pine Street being knocked down and potentially this one being knocked down and them not having a cumulative effect, I guess, on each other. But, are these the last two that are left in the city? I just don't know. So, I really want to understand if there's any data available on how many of these structures are left and how many are actually on soft sites with height limits that have, many multiples of what they actually are now and slated to be probably redeveloped or demolished. That would really, really help me. I do support an additional preservation alternative as the HPC had asked for, and the way things are, in my mind, leaning, and I know this is a comment on the DER, but I'm leaning towards supporting a partial preservation alternative for the project itself. Thank you.
Commissioner Moore.
I'd like to pose one additional challenge, and I think it goes hand in hand with the preservation alternative. I'd like to see a project which can function without aggregating parcels. By aggregating parcels and taking both historic buildings down, you're basically only maximizing of what is, even in the most extreme, potentially developable on this land. Tying two independent structures together with a pedestrian bridge in order to maximize the number of units, for me, is a very dangerous precedent because you're creating a north-south wall effect and a clumsy massing which only serves the person who builds a building, but creates more problems than we can probably even throw a stick at this moment. So I like to see a clear justification and an examination in this EIR why, for this particular project, the parcels need to be aggregated.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you very much. I think the other commissioners have elucidated comments about the building alternatives pretty well. I'll just focus on the transportation and one question in particular. The Market Octavia plan in general calls for, as part of looking at some of the open space improvements, to make Oak Street 2 ways, and it's currently depicted as 1 way, limits Oak Street, in the EIR. And I think that this severely impacts the circulation issues that were mentioned before, because it means that in order to get to the parking, you have to come in off of Van Ness rather than being able to go up and around, which I think in many cases will alleviate some of the additional circulation impacts. So I would like a discussion of why that is not included as part of the transportation assessment. And if it needs to be, it would be great to see that updated in the final EIR.
Commissioner Richards.
Yeah, one last question, I guess, parlaying on Commissioner Moore. I'm kind of a child of the Market Octavia plan. And again, I don't have my material in front of me, but the lot size, one of the things that we did when we actually worked on it with the planning department and came up with the final plan was discourage combination of lots. And here we do have 2 lots being combined for probably more than 10,000 square feet, which is something that we really did not want to have happen in the Market Octavia plan. So, here we have a project that's combining lots, and I'm trying to understand why, and it goes against the spirit of everything we try to do for the plan.
Commissioners, that would conclude this item, and I believe you'll be taking a break.
Yep. Commission will take a lunch break. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the San Francisco Planning Commission regular meeting for Thursday, February 26, 2015. I'd like to remind members of the audience that the Commission does not tolerate any disruption or outbursts of any kind, and to please silence any mobile devices that may sound off during these proceedings. Commissioners, we left off under your regular calendar on item 11 for case number 2014-003269, PCA, off-street parking exceptions. This is a planning code amendment.
Commissioners, Diego Sanchez with Planning Department staff. Today I'm going to present an ordinance that proposes to amend the Planning Code to provide additional flexibility as to the provision and location of off-street parking. However, before I delve into the further details, I'd like to allow some time to Connor Johnson of Supervisor Breed's office to present.
Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. Connor Johnston, Legislative Aide to President of the Board of Supervisors, London Breed. I was telling Diego before we got started that I think my presentation ended up being about 6 or 7 minutes long, which was about 5 or 6 minutes longer than I had hoped. But there are a lot of pieces here, so I just want to go through them one by one really quickly. This legislation is a small set of planning code changes, which President Breed is calling the Parking Flexibility Ordinance. For a long time, the city had very strict minimum parking requirements, meaning, for example, when someone built new housing, they were required to include parking for all the new residents. This led to the construction of a lot of parking garages, both above and below ground, as well as parking pads in what would otherwise be green space or yards, and the use of buildings' first floors for vehicle parking instead of active retail or housing. In the past decade or so, as you all know well, with the push for more green space and more engaging ground floors, the city has implemented greater flexibility in its parking requirements. Space-efficient parking methods like tandem parking, lifts, stackers, and valet are now permitted by right, and minimum parking requirements in many of our denser, walkable, transit-rich neighborhoods have been relaxed. These changes have been very effective, and it is important to point out they do not limit anyone's ability to construct parking if they choose. They simply give people more options. This ordinance provides more flexibility as well, so that builders, businesses, and homeowners can have more say in where and if they put parking on their property. The legislation allows the conversion of existing parking to active street fronting uses, facilitates the use of space-efficient parking and the conversion of the freed space to other uses, minimizes conflicts with transit and bike lanes, and helps restore front and rear yards and encourage other neighborhood building practices. First is the issue of gross floor area, or GFA in planner speak. GFA limits how much square footage someone can build on a given parcel of land. Yet currently outside of C3 zones, parking does not count towards GFA. In other words, there are limits on how much commercial space or housing you can have, but not on parking, at least not under GFA. And if you have existing parking spaces you no longer need, GFA may prevent you from converting those spaces to other uses. Neighborhood commercial districts and other city policies encourage ground floor activity, but GFA and parking minimums almost force people to use the ground floor as parking. There's a limited amount of space available in any building envelope, so why would we force it to be used as parking? Do we really want to prioritize parking over jobs and housing? This legislation will make it so that above-ground accessory parking will count toward a building's gross floor area, but principally permitted underground parking will remain exempt. This will encourage new developments to put their parking underground and use the first floor for active uses like retail and housing. And existing buildings will be able to convert unused parking spaces if they choose. Again, it's about giving people the option to choose. Second, the legislation gives more flexibility for required parking in RM districts by allowing the off-street spaces to be located anywhere within 600 feet. And if you're following along on Mr. Sanchez's report, I made sure to go in the same order that he did. So my 1, 2, 3, 4 are the same as his. Third, the legislation gives the zoning administrator the authority to administratively remove a vestigial or inapplicable off-street parking requirement as long as the property is complying with the new applicable regulations. In recent years, the city has lowered or eliminated parking requirements or added permittable exceptions in all zoning districts except RH. So we should make it easier for properties to shed bygone requirements. Lastly, the legislation exempts buildings from minimum parking requirements if their sole street frontage is on a bike path or dedicated transit lane. Again, this does not prohibit off-street parking. It simply gives people the option not to build or to convert it. So houses along the new bike lanes on Oak and Fell in District 5, for example, could turn their garage into housing without needing a costly variance. We could actually create new rent-controlled housing out of unused garages in this way. And this provision can reduce conflicts and hazards on the city's bike and transit lanes, improving safety for bicyclists and travel times for Muni riders. The legislation also allows exemptions from minimum parking requirements if doing so will improve an existing building's front, side, or rear yard. Parking minimums existed in the code before many of the green space and yard requirements, so many building owners paved over their yards to create off-street parking. If people want to keep those spots, they can, but if they don't, this legislation will help them to remove the spot and restore some of the green space to their homes and character to the neighborhoods. This legislation is carefully crafted to provide people with options. We can activate ground floor spaces, improve bicyclist safety and Muni performance, and restore green spaces and yards. I do want to just briefly, and I don't mean to get ahead of the process here, but I just want to briefly give our response to Mr. Sanchez's staff report. And I want to preempt that by saying I think he did an outstanding job of analyzing the legislation and came up with some very important points, and so we're very appreciative of his analysis. And just to go through his recommendations one by one, the first is to clarify that the ZA may reduce or waive requirements pursuant to the procedures of Section 307H2. Absolutely, great idea, certainly logical under the code. We fully support it. He suggested changing the term bicycle path to bikeway. I'm not sure I understand the difference, but the MTA suggested that, and it seems logical, so we're on board as well. And then he suggested exempting GFA devoted to off-street parking from the development impact fee calculations. We certainly agree with this. I think it's a conversation that is outside the scope of this legislation. You certainly could make a policy argument that we shouldn't be incenting the production of parking and disincenting the production of housing in this way, but that is a conversation for another day and certainly another piece of legislation. So we agree with Mr. Sanchez's recommendation there as well. And I also just want to briefly mention that we are considering an amendment to grandfather in projects that already have submitted their applications in the Van Ness SUD. The amendment is in development, but broadly speaking, it would say that if the sponsor proceeds to the Planning Commission within the next 2 years, the conditionally permitted amount of accessory parking would be exempt from GFA. I just want to make sure this idea is substantively discussed before the Commission, so I think I have now done so. And with that, I will turn the floor back over to Mr. Sanchez, unless there are any questions, or I'm happy to take them after his report.
Commissioner Moore.
Mr. Connor, there's one question, that is the 25-foot sidewalk rule, which I didn't quite understand reading it. Could you explain that, please?
You know, I think it may be better if I defer to Mr. Sanchez there, because that is a logistical issue that he may know better than me.
Oh, okay, that does not come from you, that was added by planning?
Correct. I mean, the policy directive from our office was transit lane, bike lane, and I think that the 25-foot sidewalk is a nuance that we didn't initiate.
Okay, I don't quite understand it, but perhaps Mr. Sanchez can explain it then later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Connor, for that. So just to rehash, the department's recommendation is to add text to Section 161 to clarify and codify that any waivers or reductions would be done by the zoning administrator according to Section 307H. We, on the advice of the SFMTA, we are proposing to change the term bicycle path to bikeway, as that encompasses on-street bike facilities, not just bike paths that one would find in Golden Gate Park. And then regarding the exemption for GFA, as Mr. Johnson referenced, the current Nexus study, the current Nexus studies do not take into account GFA with off-street parking. To change the basis of how those fees are calculated, department thought would necessitate a new Nexus study and arguably a larger outreach process to outreach to affected parties regarding this. This ordinance doesn't explicitly mention that development impact fees would increase, so it was thought that that again should be another conversation. Between the time of the report publication and today, I did receive some public comment, and I have email copies of that, and it's in reference to the exemption for projects in the Van Ness SUD. And then, if I may conclude to answer Commissioner Moore's question about the 25-foot parking. That's actually, this is actually in place under Planning Code Section 161B. There's an exemption for from providing off-street loading across very wide sidewalks. The supervisors in her legislation is proposing to include off-street parking as well, and that's found on in your packet as part of the proposed ordinance on page 6 of the proposed ordinance and begins on line 5. So if I'm understanding this ordinance correctly, in the instance where there is a property whose sole access is across a wide sidewalk of 25 feet width or more, the zoning administrator would be able to waive the off-street parking requirement in this instance, much like he can waive the loading requirement. So that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Opening it up to public comment.
Jonas, I've got a... Good afternoon, Commissioners. Steve Vettel with Farella, Brown, and Martell. I wanted to speak to what Mr. Johnson brought up about a potential grandfather provision that would apply just in the Van Ness Special Use District. And the reason that this is a peculiar situation is that unlike other residential districts, other NC districts, other mixed-use districts in the Van Ness Special Use District, there is a very strict FAR limit that was enacted in the 1980s when the Van Ness Special Use District was created. And the problem with this legislation is that just in December, the requirement for off-street parking in the Van Ness Special Use District went down from 1:1 to 0.75 with conditional use, 0.5 as of right. What this legislation would do, if it's not amended, is require a fair amount of FAR that's limited in that district to be allocated to off-street parking, and would reduce the amount of FAR that can be devoted to housing. And so this grandfather provision would probably only apply to a couple of projects that are already in the pipeline, that are already designed, that have underground parking, that have a parking ratio of 0.75 or less. Let that underground parking at 0.75 not count against FAR, so that the housing does not need to be reduced to account for that loss of FAR. So that's the rather complicated reason and the reason for this proposed grandfather provision that I've handed out to you. I have talked with Tom Radulovich, who worked with Supervisor Breed's office to write this legislation, been in contact with the supervisor's office, and everyone seems to be comfortable that this makes sense for the small class of projects that are already in the pipeline in this one zoning district. So I would like you to favorably consider that amendment. The rest of the legislation, I think, makes a lot of sense and is very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any additional public comment? Okay, public comment is closed. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you. So just really quickly, I think talking about some of the suggested changes from the planning department and the suggested amendment to exclude Van Ness SUD. So my reading of this legislation was that it encourages ground floor uses other than parking, because the policy argument is that if you have to pay, if your first floor essentially is included in your FAR calculation, regardless of what you use it for, then using it for commercial or residential or even open space uses is a much higher value proposition than parking. Would that be a correct reading of the policy argument for why you would want to include ground floor parking in FAR calculation?
Diego Sanchez with staff. From the department's position, we'd want to include ground floor parking into the FAR calculation, incentivize other uses such as commercial or active street frontage usage. I think there are a lot of urban design goals that can be accomplished if there aren't off-street parking garages or lots at the ground floor. So I think if we can incentivize other uses at the ground floor, I think it satisfies a lot of different policy goals that the city has made.
Okay, great. So given that, I'll just have two quick questions. Hopefully we'll get through this pretty quickly. On the suggested amendment exempting projects in the Van Ness SUD, those projects that spurred the amendment, they're underground. If we did not pass that, or if we did not, recommend that amendment, their underground parking already would not count against FAR because that's not the recommended legislation. Is that correct? I'm not understanding the
So
amendment.
if you locate your parking at ground floor or above, it counts towards the FAR, or if any parking that's above what's principally permitted will count irrespective of its location on your lot, underground, first, second, third floor. If I'm understanding some of the public comment, the concern is that they are going forward with what's conditionally allowed, which is above 0.5. I'm assuming they have 0.75, which is about above what they're allowed. They would have to dedicate some FAR to that 0.25. And if I'm understanding the public comment, that's an unexpected change in their pro forma and their design.
Okay. I guess I'm just, okay. Well, other commissioners may have questions about that. If it's not answered by the time it's time for a vote, we'll come back to that. Generally speaking, I think I'm pretty supportive. I only have a question. This goes more towards the viability of the incentive, right? So do we find that underground parking works for most projects? This is just more of a general question, right? So most of the time when we see the off-street parking included into multifamily or multi-use buildings, the ground floor is part of that planning. If we were to incentivize other uses of the ground floor, do you think that we would see less parking because undergrounding is not as viable, or it's more expensive than it would be to just try to put it on the ground floor? Is my question making sense? Like, what's the cost benefit here, and are we really going to see the change that we want to see by incentivizing underground parking?
The department thinking is that if you're going to locate parking underground, it's a very costly endeavor, especially here in San Francisco. So the thought is if we can provide flexibility, and we're hoping that that'll happen. We haven't done any cost-benefit analysis, if that's what you're looking for. We don't have a study that says, we've looked at X 10 different projects and these would be the effects. But I think what we're trying to do is offer flexibility, and we think it'll happen, but we don't have a cost-benefit and financial analysis to back that up.
Okay. I guess I just wonder, I don't even question it, I just wonder if for a given project, if the project sponsor does their market research and they realize, they're going to be able to realize a certain return if they include up to the maximum allowable parking. I wonder if they're not just going to pay the impact fee for the FAR of parking rather than not having it at all. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
I'm not.
They may do that, or they may also elect to put residential units there as well, which I don't have the financial analysis to see what would pencil out better, but the residential units wouldn't count against FAR in most cases. So.
Right. I know. Okay. So those are my questions for now. We'll see what other commissioners have to say about it.
Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, I like this legislation because it allows project sponsors the flexibility to still make choices whether or not they want to have parking. In my opinion, it's most directed at existing parking that was built in the past at ground level that can be converted to better uses at this time because it would allow them to convert that parking to, housing or other uses on the ground level, which we're encouraging more. In the past, there was more of a tendency to put parking on ground level, and we always had these problems with how are we going to mask it, because original projects you'd look in and see this parking, which wasn't very attractive, and then you'd see other projects where blank walls were put up to mask it, but that also wasn't very attractive. But I'm supportive of all the amendments because they all make sense to me, including the one proposed by Mr. Vettel to grandfather, because a lot of these projects, or almost all of them that are included, have done a pro forma, have put their projects together already, and there's a time period during which they have to come through, I guess, to actually have these built or approval. I'm not quite sure. Mr. Sanchez, is it they have to be under construction or they have to be approved within that period of time for 2 years?
Are you referencing the exemption?
The amendment.
The amendment. At this point, I'm a little bit unclear on what the amendment's going to be. Our position is it came in after, so we haven't formulated or have seen anything in writing formally.
We have a copy of it here, and it talks. Maybe I can ask Mr. Vettel.
Sure.
He might be able to explain it, or Mr. Johnson might know.
Yeah, Connor Johnston, legislative aide to Board President Breed. I think it's important to point out that what you have in front of you is proposed by a member of the public, that our office hasn't drafted anything yet.
Right.
So we don't have language. I can give you a sense of where we're headed, which is that if the application is already submitted and they proceed to the commission within 2 years from the operative date of the legislation, then the grandfather exemption would apply.
Okay, so it's basically they have to have an application in, and they have 2 years to actually get the approval. And the approval date is going to be the measuring point of the 2 years from the time the mayor signs it into law, I guess.
Correct. That's what we're thinking at this point.
All right. That sounds fine to me. It makes sense because a lot of these are projects that are in existence and already planned. And in all of this legislation, the option still exists what to do, whether to have parking, whether not to have parking. And, to try to change it at this point, and these projects that are already in the pipeline probably isn't a good idea. I think that's mainly aimed at the more fine-grained areas of that President Breed is aiming at, in my estimation, where open space would be brought in. Parking wouldn't be going through areas of bike lanes. A lot of other things that, on big streets where there already are lots of curb cuts and it's, areas where parking is part of almost every project, it probably isn't going to be as much of an issue. So I'm supporting the legislation and the recommendations of staff and the amendment that's proposed by Mr. Vettel.
Commissioner Wu.
Thank you. Mr. Sanchez, could I ask about this impact fee recommendation? So could you give me an example of how it is now and how it would be after the legislation? Is it now that impact fees are calculated with some connection to FAR or no connection to FAR?
So the issue is that currently the impact fees don't account for gross floor area devoted to off-street parking. So if we were to change the definition, or basically the basis of how we calculated impact fees, it's unclear. We don't have a definitive understanding if the Nexus study and the maximum supportable fees can absorb that. So that's the question here. I think also,
I think to clarify, impact fees are based on gross floor area.
Okay.
And currently, parking is not included in gross floor area.
Even though gross floor area should be kind of like an agnostic term, like does it matter what the use is within that?
Well, I mean, in the sense that impact fees are based on impacts of uses.
Okay.
That's why we're raising the flag of the Nexus study.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Commissioner Johnson.
Okay, so this, I think I got it now. So are we saying that right now we would have to redo the impact fee analysis or look at that part, because if you have parking on the ground floor and it counts as part of gross floor area, as it would be if this legislation were passed, we don't have the data to support that ground floor parking has the same impacts as other types of uses on the ground floor. Okay, I got it now. Sorry, I was like a little lost for a second. Got it.
Commissioner Antonini.
So I'm going to make a motion to approve to include staff's 3 recommendations and also to include the following language. Amend Section 3 on page 7 of the ordinance to read, Section 3, effective date. This ordinance shall become effective 30 days from the date of passage, except that the amendment to Section 102.9B6 shall not apply to projects in Van Ness Special Use District that obtain a site or building permit prior to June 20th, 2017, in which the gross square area shall not be include floor space dedicated to parking that does not exceed the principally permitted or conditionally permitted as accessory and is located underground.
Do I hear a second?
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you very much. I personally am not going to second that because on that particular exemption for projects in the Van Ness SUD, it sounds like Supervisor Breed's office is going to take that under advisement, and I think we can add that as a finding with our recommendation, and the Supervisor Breed's office can work on whatever language they want. I would also like to see, maybe I'll make a motion, but I'll say this first and see if there's any other comments. If we need to look at the analysis to see if there's a good backing behind including ground floor parking in the gross floor area calculation for development impact fee purposes, I'd want to have it explicit in our findings or in our recommendation when we would be doing that analysis. Would it just be part of the next version of looking at impact fees, or do we need to look at some other sort of assessment? So that's a question for Director Ram, and then depending on the answer, I would like to see that.
I think the answer is that we'd have to look at it in the context of the updates to the nexus analysis, which I believe are done every 5 years
right.
under state law. But I think it's important to remember that there's an implicit assumption that the parking is serving the use that's creating the impact. So I think I would just caution that suddenly we would get a lot more impact fees, because it might be that the impact fee on a per square foot basis is actually lessened and multiplied by a bigger number. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Because they're already, it's sort of built into the assumption already that a project has a certain amount of parking when we look at impacts analysis. So that would be my only word of caution on that. I can't specifically say that would happen, but there's an implicit assumption that projects of any use have a certain amount of parking typically.
Okay. There's a couple other people. We'll see.
Commissioner Wu.
I agree with that sentiment about the direction, but I wanted to ask City Attorney, can we just make it part of our motion to recommend that the Supervisor's Office include some grandfathering clause for the Van Ness SUD? Or should it belong in the findings?
Commissioners, Kate Stacy from the City Attorney's Office. I think it's up to the Commission. You could do it either way, make the recommendation and leave the details to the supervisor, or include a more detailed recommendation.
Okay.
Commissioner Moore.
I would like to recommend it to the supervisor, particularly with the emphasis that quite recently we have approved a number of projects which would be affected by this. There are probably others already in the pipeline, and I want to be cautious that we are not creating too much confusion about the subject matter, but have her basically support that this commission has looked at this already on a number of projects.
Commissioner Antonini.
Oh, Mr. Johnson, did you want to comment?
Yeah, Connor Johnson, legislative aide to President Breed. I just wanted to ask Commissioner, are you suggesting that there may be other areas where we might want to look at grandfathering for current projects?
No, the one we have done a lot of work on where it's critical is indeed the special use district, the Van Ness special use district. If the department off the top of their head has to caution us and remind us that there are others, I would appreciate if there would, but I cannot think of any other.
Okay. I will make sure that we double check with planning staff in the course of drafting that amendment.
It should look positive and suggestive rather than vindictive and past the fact. That is kind of, I think, what I think we need to do.
Commissioner Antonini.
So I'll make another motion. I'd like to support approval with modifications presented by staff and ask President Breed's office to work with Mr. Vettel to see if it's appropriate to include the suggested legislation in regards to the projects on Van Ness Special Use District.
So
we don't need to name Mr. Vettel.
All right, we don't have to name.
the way I
that's
receive.
what we're talking about, though.
Commissioner Antonini, if I understood your motion, you were making a motion to approve with modifications, but outside of the actual motion itself, you were making a request.
A finding. It's
it was part of a finding. Okay,
Yeah.
then I misunderstood. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. They should work together and see what happens with that.
I would suggest that we.
I'll just make another motion. Okay.
Commissioner Johnson.
I'm going to make another motion. That one wasn't seconded. So I make a motion to recommend the legislation with modification, with the finding that Supervisor Breed's office look into exemptions for certain projects on the Van Ness SUD. And we also make a finding that we will review in the future the impact of including ground floor parking in the gross square area. Gross square footage calculation for development impact fee purposes.
If you want to include that second finding, that's fine. I would say it's not just ground floor, though. I mean, there are buildings that have parking on more than one level.
Well, then I'll leave that out because that's going to be part of our looking at the development policy. That's going to be part of the policy. So leave out the second finding. That's our motion.
Good, because I didn't get that second one anyway.
Yeah, good. So.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It wasn't specific about, you said exemption, but it's like a grandfathering clause is what you were really going for.
So was it grandfathering not?
Yeah.
Okay, so restating my motion. I think I got it, but I'll restate it anyways. Make a motion to recommend the legislation with modifications with the finding that Supervisor Breed's office investigate at grandfathering for certain projects in the Van Ness SUD. Yes.
Okay, and is that amenable to the seconder? Thank you.
Commissioner Moore.
The byline is that Mr. Johnson and staff will make sure that there are not any other areas other than Van Ness Special Use District which will be affected by that.
Commissioners, there is a motion and a second to adopt a recommendation for approval with modifications, finding that Supervisor Breed's office look into a grandfathering clause for projects along the Van Ness Special Use District corridor. On that motion, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commissioner President Fong.
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you on item 12 for case number 2014.1204C at 115 through 117 Plymouth Avenue, conditional use authorization.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Michael Smith, Planning Department staff. The project before you proposes to demolish the remnants of an existing two-family dwelling located at 115-117 Plymouth Avenue between Sagamore and Sadawa Streets in the Ocean View neighborhood, and to construct in its place a three-story mixed-use building. The proposed building will have 4 dwelling units and 3 off-street parking spaces and ground floor commercial space with tenants and use yet to be determined. The property contains the remnants of an existing two-story, two-family dwelling that was constructed in 1905. The building is currently vacant and is uninhabitable due to neglect and the actions of a prior property owner. City records are inconclusive, but indicate that the building is authorized as a two-family dwelling with 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms within 900 square feet of habitable area. The department has not received any comments from the public regarding this project. Our recommendation is to approve the project with conditions because we believe it would add 4 family-sized dwelling units to the city's housing stock within an established neighborhood. It would create a small commercial space that is ideal for locally owned small business owners. And it would make use of an underutilized, blighted property. And lastly, no tenants would be displaced by this project. This concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions or comments.
Project sponsor, please.
You have a 10-minute presentation.
Mr. Smith said everything there was to say. I mean, I don't really have anything else to add.
Okay, thank you. Opening it up for public comment, if there's any. Seeing none, public comment is closed. Commissioner Moore.
I want to congratulate the developer for doing something as bold and simple as it is, particularly underutilized properties being reused in a manner that to address some of the urgent questions we ask every week is a great idea. I have to ask for a couple of very minor revisions, and they have something to do with what we see on page A21, and it has something to do with parking. The way this drawing is shown actually does it, given the width of the garage door, does not allow 3 parking spaces to function, particularly when there's access to the outdoor area and if you have indeed bicycle parking for 8 bicycles in the small room that's provided there. It's impossible. The dimension strings do not allow proper working of these functions with each other. So what I'd like to suggest is the side lights next to the garage door are not necessary. A garage is a garage. What this space potentially could do is being used as another commercial space, and that is not what we are approving and want today. So I would suggest that we move the garage door, take the side lights out, move the garage door to the north, have 2 parking spaces, have an adequate wide access for the residents to go into the garden space that comes through the garage, as you probably see. That we widen the bicycle parking a little bit so that you indeed can hang your bicycles on the wall and have sufficient room to do so. And those would be my suggestions. There would be a minor change in the facade, but the building itself, I think, is a gutsy, strong building. It will not really alter anything, but the 3 spaces as they are currently drawn don't work. I make a motion that we take, that we approve with a modification about 2 cars. We can do so that, given the fact that we have, what is this called? What type of bicycle parking are we doing here? We're doing the type of bicycle parking which would allow us to reduce parking to 2 cars. And that is my suggested change to the plan as it stands, including taking the side lights next to the garage door out.
Commissioner, I just want to get some clarity on what you're asking. So the garage door is currently at, I believe, 10 feet in width.
That's correct.
So I have it on the overhead, the ground floor plan. So you're talking about shifting this garage door over
to the north, to the right, where
to
you
the
are.
right. Okay.
Yes, taking this spot away, widening the corridor to have a comfortable access to the garden space, and potentially widening the bicycle storage area by a couple of feet, which would slide the garden door a little bit further to the north as well.
Okay.
Confirm that there's not a problem reducing the parking by 1. That's doable under the code.
I think you have class.
Yeah, there is no problem reducing. I mean, I would need to make some modifications to the motion, which currently refers to 3 parking spaces, but there's no problem code-wise. Do you understand?
Yeah, I understand. My only comment is that the neighborhood, the people who are living in the neighborhood, the only comments they have made to me about the project is there going to be off-street parking, because parking on the street is limited in the area, and everybody fights for parking all over the street. So I have no problem doing it, but that's what the neighborhood, one more car on the street, will be what they're concerned with.
I tried to look at angular parking, but that doesn't work either. And straight end parking for 3 cars doesn't work. Not the way it's drawn. And I don't know any other way of solving it.
Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, what was the question I had originally when I read this is you got 4 units. I didn't know why there weren't 4 parking places, because I know in those areas parking is at a premium, and apparently you're amenable with only 3. Is that all right with your project?
My only comment was that, 2 parking spaces, more bicycle parking, I have no problem with that. I just wanted to tell you that what and what Mr. Smith just said to me is probably true. Getting 3 cars in there is going to be difficult.
That's
originally I was told I had to have 4, and we put in an application to reduce it to 3. Reducing it to 2, I personally have, as a developer, have no problem with that. So I kind of like the idea of bigger bicycle.
I just like to suggest to you, even if it's drawn, it just doesn't work. And that's what we're here to check out and basically say, I cannot force you to put 3 cars in because they don't fit in the garage.
Yeah.
So if we say 2, and you have people who come in with half cars, like little smart cars, you can probably get 4 cars in. But the normal car dimensions we are supposed to use here do not allow 3 cars in the garage and makes the bicycle thing work. That's the only comment. I don't want you any ill.
Yeah, I guess.
Commissioner Johnson.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Anthony.
Well, I was just saying, if project sponsor is okay with the lower amount, I don't quite understand why these spaces. I'll take Commissioner Moore's word on the fact that it'd be hard to get those cars. It looks like there's enough room, but it just depends on the angles, I guess. If they don't fit, they don't fit.
Radius.
Yeah. They don't fit.
Commissioner Richards.
I second the motion.
Commissioners, there is a motion and a second.
That's car, the real wheels.
Yes. Okay, Commissioners, there is a motion and a second to approve the project with conditions as amended to move the garage door north, eliminating the side lights and increasing the area for bike storage. And limiting the project to 2 off-street parking spaces.
It also included widening the hallway.
No, it would already widen it by not having
The door to the garden, the access to the garden will shift a little bit because you're widening the bicycle space. That's automatic.
That's why there has to be a room there.
Okay.
Commissioner Johnson.
Just a quick question to Commissioner Moore. Can we look at maybe taking that wall away from the bike storage? I'm not understanding why it has to be a separate room.
The code, I think, requires that it's locked bicycle storage.
That is correct.
Okay.
Class 1 bicycle parking does have to be more secure than just being in a garage space.
And that is why you can reduce parking. If I would take the wall away, I would be stuck with a higher parking.
Okay, thank you.
I do have one, concern. So, as the motion currently reads, I have once again, the facade on the overhead. So we're talking about shifting the garage door over. And I'm just concerned about how, because currently it lines up underneath the bay window, and how that's really going to work, and if we're okay with that. I understand what the goal is, which is to reduce the 1 parking space and provide greater access to the rear yard. I'm just not sure if we needed to necessarily design the facade right here.
I'm not trying to design the garage facade, but if one would take the color of the door as a symmetrically placed element in red, it's very nice because it kind of accentuates the building being symmetrical. If the garage door blends more into the color of the facade while it shifts north, it would be basically acceptable.
Commissioner Antonini.
I missed when Commissioner Moore suggested moving the door. I'm not sure what we're gaining here because we've taken away the additional parking place. They either go to one side or the other. They could still come out of the same place. What are we gaining by moving the door?
The car furthest to the north as it's drawn can't get in or get out if the second car is in its spot. There is not enough room in there. And if you back out while the other car's in its place, you'll clip the car's rear fender. The movements are very clear. There are lines you draw when you design parking, and this parking doesn't work.
Commissioner, may I suggest maybe, I have to say I share Mr. Smith's concern about the facade. If he can get 2 parking spaces in there and keep the facade, keep the door the way it is, as long as the angles work, would that be acceptable?
It's acceptable if you can prove that the angles work. We cannot approve a building which doesn't work. If you can draw the lines, the necessary lines on plan, you know how to do that. By all means, I like to keep the door there, but I don't think it works.
Maybe it would require that the space closest to the wall shift a little bit to the left. That would allow.
Perhaps so. If that's possible, yeah.
So maybe the motion could read, assuming the angle of entry works, to limit it to 2 parking spaces and leave the garage door in place if possible.
We could just limit it to 2 off-street parking spaces.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We approve the project with 2 off-street parking spaces.
Okay. Yeah.
And then try to work with the location of the door by shifting the parking in the garage a little bit.
However it works out.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Commissioner, so that's amenable to the maker and the seconder.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Someone just needs to put a little bit on it.
So then, Commissioners, there is a motion and a second to approve this project with conditions as amended to include that the number of off-street parking spaces be limited to 2 and to increase the bicycle storage area. On that motion, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu. And Commission President Fong.
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you on item 13 for case number 2014.1393C at 1135 Evans Avenue. This is also a conditional use authorization.
Thank you. Omar Masri, Planning Department staff, Commissioner, Chair, President Fong, members of the Planning Commission. The item before you is a request to modify an existing Sprint macro wireless facility at 1135 Evans Avenue. The project site is a PG&E substation featuring multiple 70-foot tall transmission lattice towers, which currently features existing antennas for both Sprint, T-Mobile, and Verizon Wireless. The request before you would increase the overall number of antennas from 3 to 6 panel antennas mounted to the lattice tower, as well as modify some of the existing equipment at the ground level equipment area without any change to the overall footprint of that equipment area. Project sponsor held a community meeting to which no members of the public attended, and staff has not received any comments from the general public. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Opening it up to project sponsor. Is there a project sponsor here?
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Veazey, and I'm here on behalf of Sprint. And I've read the executive summary and the entire conditional use authorization, including the conditions of approval, and I agree with them all. I think it's a very accurate and complete summary, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you. Is there any public comment on this item? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Commissioner Antonini.
Move to approve.
Second.
On that motion, Commissioners, to approve this matter with conditions, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commission President Fong.
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you under your discretionary review calendar on item 14 for case number 2013.0560 DRP at 417 30th Street. This is a discretionary review.
Good afternoon, Planning Commission, Delvin Washington, Southwest Team Leader. Subject property is located at 417 30th Street, Noe Valley, between Noe Valley and Glen Park to the south on 30th Street. This area serves as a border between these two neighborhoods. This particular block of 30th Street is higher in elevation on the west and west end and slopes downward toward the east. Current property is a one-bedroom single-family residence on south side of 30th Street, one story over a raised basement and parking area. The site has an upsloping rear yard. The proposal is to expand an existing single-family residence by excavating for the new habitable floor space in the basement and constructing a new vertical and horizontal addition and new front and rear decks. The alteration needs no variances. The subject property measures between 25 and 100 feet in depth. The neighboring parcel at the corner of 30th and Harper Street historically measures 25 by 100 with only one structure on the north end of the lot. However, by 1915, 3 structures occupied the parcel and each has little to no open space or rear yard. The property was subsequently subdivided into 3 non-conforming parcels also in what appears to be in 1915. The DR Filer's residence is one of these properties. In response to the neighbors' concerns about loss of light, the residential design team instructed the project sponsor to remove a 6-foot-tall privacy fence at the rear of the deck and to construct nothing above the required safety railing height in that location. They felt that these measures, along with the proposed side setback from 9 Harper property line windows, were sufficient and created no exceptional or extraordinary circumstances. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you. DR requester, you have 5 minutes. Sure. I'm sorry. Which one was that?
Yes. My name is Saren. I'm the property owner at 9 Harper Street. I'd like to thank you for taking this time to hear my case. As he has just concluded, the residential design team has recommended the elimination of the 6-foot tall privacy fence and maintained the planter at 3'6" safety railing height. My only lasting concern is this planter slash railing, which is actually a solid structure, and I will illustrate this impact here. This is the street view. I've cut away the facade so that you can see the 3 spaces that are adjacent to my neighboring property. This is with the neighboring property and addition built up. And the dotted line shows the extent of the building bulk behind. And this is the safety railing slash planter, which is exceeds the rear bump out maximum height of 10 feet by 3'6". It will be a solid item that is in plan. Here's the plan that was submitted. And these are the zoomed in version. The planter is 5'6" wide and 12 feet long and 3'6" high. 3'6" high. So it is comparable to size of my bathroom. And a soil depth of 3 feet allows for trees to grow. So not only will their planter be a solid surface right outside the window, it will allow for significant amount of planting. And this is a section cut through my bedroom to the deck. And I've shown the condition as proposed and if the planter is gone, or if there's a safety railing of cable rail or glass. I recognize that poses privacy issues for both parties that is not beneficial. So I've shown ways where the planter could be reduced in height, this is moved narrower. If it were narrower, it would allow more light into my home, the one window of the one bedroom, and it wouldn't reduce any square footage on the proposed property. Or it could be shortened in height, which would not provide a safety hazard because there actually is no safety railing requirement on that side because there isn't that much of a drop. And it would reduce the planting that could possibly grow there as well. So my suggestions, point one is that this planter is exceeding the rear bump out allowance by 3'6". It is of a significant size so that it could be considered part of a building mass. And it is also a solid material. I would urge for some sort of modification of the mass or a stipulation that the material be translucent. That's all.
Are there any speakers in support of the DR? Requester? Okay, seeing none, project sponsor?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is George Klum. I'm one of the homeowners. My partner, Michael Steele, here is also a homeowner. I'm also the architect for the project. Michael and I bought the house 5 years ago after we've been in Noe Valley for 8 years, really like the neighborhood, and we've really grown to love it. And we bought the house in order to make it our home, a long-term home, and this addition will hopefully help us do that. I'd like to point out that when we bought the house, it was in very poor condition. It was an eyesore in the neighborhood. We have since improved the foundations, added a garage, and restored the historic 1892 facade. Even though our project is designed within the limits of the planning code, we made several concessions during the review process. We've set the second level back from the front facade, which is already set back from the sidewalk, and that was due to historic preservation, and we totally embrace that because I think it's going to make the structure, the end structure, a better building. The roof line has been flattened to reduce the impact to neighbors' views. And I'd also like to point out that we currently don't have any privacy in our backyard. The lot is oriented north-south, so by the time the sun reaches noon, our backyard is completely, it starts to be shaded, and within a couple of hours, we have no sunlight in the backyard, not only because of 9 Harper, but also because of 11 Harper. And one of our goals in doing this addition is to have the deck so that we're raised up out of that shadow and we can enjoy the sunlight as well, just like some of our neighbors want. I'd also want to point out that we have widened the light well from originally 4 feet wide in front of Saran's windows to now 5 feet. We've accepted that. And the planter itself has been widened since we made our first application, so the deck is now reduced, and the total width between the east side of the planter and the face of Saran's windows is almost 12 feet. So it's almost half the lot away from her windows, and I think that's a fairly good separation for both of us. And we've taken away the privacy fence. There was a privacy fence on the west side of our planter. We originally put it in there thinking that Saran would want that, and we talked about materials, and then eventually it came out that she didn't want the privacy fence at all, and that works for us. We're more than happy to do that. In terms of the height of the planter, I think the 3'6" parapet height is allowed for the pop-out addition that goes into the backyard. The planter would not be 3 feet deep. It would be probably 12 inches maximum. And in fact, we did the same thing on our garage at the street. On top of the garage, there's a 12-inch deep planter that has now transformed that front facade. And we're hoping the same thing happens with this backyard planter. And we haven't planted anything in the light well in front of Saran's windows so that she doesn't have any further obstructions. But as Saran suggested, to pull that planter away from her wall even further and have flat roof there, I think would be an eyesore for both properties. So I think we've done quite a bit already, and we're interested in hearing your comments. Michael, did you want to add anything? So that concludes it. With your approval, we look forward to moving forward with our project. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any speakers in support of the project sponsor? Okay, seeing none. DR requester, you have a 2-minute rebuttal if you choose. You don't have to, okay. Project sponsor, you have a 2-minute rebuttal if you, okay. The public hearing is closed, and opening it up to commissioners, Commissioner Moore.
We just, I think, last week had a project where we at length discussed the issue of privacy, which in a strong build-up of the city becomes increasingly more important as we want to give equal rights to those people who want to improve and expand their homes, but also those who don't have any place to go to, such as the 3 little subdivided cottages next door, that livability is not impacted one way or the other. The situation from last week is that we had a property and we recommended a planter to create additional separation. In that particular case, the addition was lower than the window to be looked into, which required privacy. Here we have exactly the opposite. And talking with Mr. Washington earlier, my feeling is that the planter is not the correct solution here. But I believe that pulling the deck in its entirety, particularly because it's a deck off a bedroom in, to make it a 10 by 12 size deck would give, for my eyes, the right separation. It was kind of interesting, Mr. Washington, if I can engage you in the conversation for a moment. It sounded as if you had independent of what I just kind of hinted on, similar thoughts about it.
Yes, I did. I thought about that as well. I know our residential design team was okay with the deck in its current configuration. The project sponsor had given some concessions on behalf of the neighbor and some concerns about trying to resolve some of the scale and massing, and they have done. They have given up a good amount of area, but one of the concerns they had was just the loss on the DR Filer's residence, the 3 windows that are facing this property. One of the windows that way could still be allowed to maintain its current level of light into her residence on that side, and the project sponsors would still be able to have a deck in that area. It would just be slightly reduced in mass and in size, but it would still provide them with the open space on that level.
As we're talking about affordability and really protecting particularly vulnerable small units, I believe that is a kind of a solid thing to do. It's still a 10 by 12 deck, is quite a large deck, and comfortable. It's south-facing. There is no shadow on it, and I would suggest that the Commission considers doing that. Particularly, we're in a very unusual situation given the 3 small homes. They basically don't have any room to go. They don't have any room to grow. They are on property line. They are literally, I'm not sure if they're properly referred to as earthquake shacks, but they have the kind of feel of that. They are very, very small units.
Commissioner?
No, I'm interested to hear what the other commissioners have to say.
Commissioner Antonini.
I could be supportive of what Commissioner Moore is suggesting. However, we have to remember that these 3 places on Harper, 3, 9, and 11 are non-conforming structures that were put in, on a lot that was really a single lot. And they built these without any thought about any open space for those cottages. So the open space that exists was someone else's property. So it's, kind of an unusual situation, but it sounds like DR requester is only asking, about one specific thing, that being the planter. But How big is the deck now, staff? What size would we be bringing the deck down to? It's down to 9 by 12, but what is it now?
10 by 12.
About 12 by 20 now, I think.
12 by 20?
Feet, 12 with the planter box.
Oh, okay.
So with the planter box, it looks like it's about 5 feet, so 12 by 15.
12, so we'd be changing it to 10 by 12.
What?
So that's still fairly good-sized deck, I would think. I don't really see the necessity that that be done, but I would probably be supportive of, it may help the DR requester with a little more light there, and I probably would be supportive of that change, although either way would work for me.
Commissioner Richards?
I think this is really unusual because you have these three houses so close together, even though there's going to be some separation, you're basically walling off the light of one entire house, as I see it. So I do think this is unusual. I do like the idea of still having the project sponsor have the programming of the backyard and the deck and the sun that they need. I think a 10 by 12 deck is reasonable versus a 12 by 20 deck, and I would support Commissioner Moore's idea, and actually I'd make a motion to reduce the deck to 10 by 12 to allow more light in the DR requester's house.
Second. Commissioner Wu.
Be clear what the suggestion is. So I'm looking at A13. So the suggestion is to get rid of the planter and then shift that, I think it would be the western wall?
That's correct.
Over 2
Towards
feet
the-
or 3 feet to make it 12 by 10.
No, you shift it by quite a bit in further. You eliminate the planter, and you make the deck at 12 by 10.
Right. So does that mean then also this door has to shift, or is this a
Yes,
window?
the door would
Okay.
shift over. It still would the entire wall would remain glass, but the ability to look for privacy reasons into the other person's home would be basically greatly reduced, including preserving light.
Commissioners, there is a motion and a second to take DR, to approve the project and take DR, eliminating the planter and reducing the size of the deck to 10 by 12. On that motion, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards. Aye. Commissioner Wu. And Commissioner President Fong.
Aye.
So moving, Commissioners, that motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you on general public comment, for which I have no speaker cards.
Is there any general public comment this evening? Okay, seeing none, the meeting is adjourned.